Committee on Transportation Infrastructure will come to order. I'd ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare recess at any time during today's hearing without objection. That is so ordered. As a reminder, if members insert a document into the record, please also email it to documentsti@mail.house.gov. I now recognize myself for the purposes of the opening statement. Last year, I, alongside Ranking Member Larson, started down the path of examining how we can fix the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. And around the same time, President Trump issued an executive order creating the FEMA Review Council to develop recommendations for the reforming of FEMA. What everyone seems to agree on is that FEMA is broken, and it's been that way for a long time. As communities impacted by disasters across the nation know, the Federal Emergency Management System needs fundamental change to reduce lives lost, speed up recovery, and lower costs to the taxpayer. For decades now, we thought we just made certain changes here. If we just made certain changes here and there, the process would get better. And in 2006, we passed the post-Katrina reforms. Then we passed the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act in 2013, and later the Disaster Recovery Reform Act of 2018. This doesn't even count the bills we passed targeting specific issues, such as bills that I authored to protect disaster victims from FEMA errors and to speed up smaller rebuilding projects. We've passed reform after reform since FEMA was put into DHS, and what was the result? We have thousands of open disaster projects dating back to Hurricane Katrina, ballooning disaster costs, and bureaucracy that feels like you need a PhD to navigate, and little common sense. Any member who has had to help constituents navigate FEMA knows how complicated that the agency can be. FEMA is supposed to lead the federal government's preparedness for mitigation against, response to, and recovery from disasters. Given this mission, it should be the nimblest federal agency that we have, but instead it continues to be swallowed up by the weight of its own red tape, regulations, and bureaucracy. And don't get me wrong, there are many good people at FEMA who want the system to work, but we need to make sure that they have the tools to be as effective as possible. Last May, Ranking Member Larson and I released a discussion draft of the Fixing the Emergency Management for Americans Act, or the FEMA Act. The committee met with and received input from over 150 stakeholders, representing state and local governments, emergency managers, nonprofits, key industries, disaster victims, and other experts and stakeholders. And we've received input from members from both sides of the aisle and on and off this committee representing communities impacted by disasters. As a result, in July last year, we officially introduced the FEMA Act, incorporating the input that we received, and in September, ordered the bill as amended, reported favorably to the House. More recently, in May of this year, the President's FEMA Review Council released its work. Not surprisingly, while there are some differences, the goals and many of the approaches in those recommendations mirror our FEMA Act. For example, we all agree reforms must be focused on a system that is state-led, locally executed, and federally supported. I have said from day one, we all agree that FEMA's reimbursement process for rebuilding is inherently flawed, and so moving to upfront grants will not only speed things up, but they're going to reduce costs. Further, we all agree that investment in mitigation is crucial, so we must ensure that funding for projects moves faster. And we are in agreement that the current way of providing assistance to disaster victims has been reformed to make more sense. Now that FEMA's Review Council recommendations have been released, we hope that we can move forward with passing the FEMA Act. And I want to thank Ranking Member Larson for the work that he did with me on this bill, and for the leadership of Mr. Webster and Subcommittee Ranking Member Stanton, who are the original co-sponsors. I look forward to hearing from our panel of experts today, and thank you all, by the way, for being here. But I look forward to hearing your thoughts on reforming FEMA. And now I recognize Rick for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Graves, for convening today's hearing on FEMA reform. I can't overstate the importance of this hearing. The effectiveness of FEMA is literally a life or death matter. FEMA has not met the moment for a lot of disaster survivors. When you look what happened after the Maui wildfires or Hurricanes Helene and Milton. But that was not because FEMA did not try hard enough. It's because FEMA doesn't have the authority it needs to help people in the best and most efficient way. Then at the start of 2025, the president said we should eliminate or overhaul FEMA. I'm not aware of anyone on this committee who thinks eliminating FEMA is a good idea. That's just not a serious proposal. But we do agree, like we have for years, that FEMA needs real reform. That's why I was pleased to team up with Chair Graves and Ranking Member Stanton and Chair Webster to write the bipartisan FEMA Act. We didn't write this bill behind closed doors. We talked to more than 150 stakeholders, put out a public draft as well, so anyone affected could weigh in. And what we ended up with is a bill that overhauls how survivors and communities get help after disaster. It facilitates investment in damage prevention and makes FEMA an independent agency again. In December 2025, floods hit my district and impacted over 100,000 Washingtonians. The floods were the most expensive natural disaster the state had seen in 40 years. About $182 million in damage to public infrastructure, about 4,000 homes damaged. Since the flooding began, I've conducted 25 site visits and meetings across impacted communities and met directly with mayors of Whatcom and Skagit counties and emergency responders. I visited federally funded home elevation projects and led direct outreach to impacted restaurants, retail stores, farms, and other small businesses in Northwest Washington state. And the president did not declare a major disaster declaration until April of 2026. That's when FEMA aid finally started moving. And people are grateful for the help, but it hasn't been easy. I've since heard from folks back home who are lost trying to figure out what aid they even qualify for, bouncing between FEMA, the Small Business Administration, U.S. Department of Ag, and Department of Housing and Urban Development. Small farmers in Snohomish and Skagit County have been hit especially hard, and a lot of them are falling through the cracks. Families are getting checks to fix their homes, but only for damage FEMA decides what makes a home unlivable. That's not the same as actually fixing what is broken. Meanwhile, state and local governments are stuck working through a bureaucracy that can take years. Emergency managers in Skagit County put these delays into perspective when they told me that 2021 flood victims did not receive mitigation grant funds to buy out and elevate their homes until 2024. Some homes flooded again, awaiting mitigation resources. And when a family is finally approved for flood mitigation funding, they have to pay for that work themselves first and hope FEMA pays them back. So the T&I committee did work and passed the FEMA Act on September 3rd of last year. And if it had become law then, Washington's recovery would look a lot different today. Survivors would not have to apply to 5 different agencies. There would be one universal application, and the government would do the work of matching people to the help they qualify instead of the other way around. Families would be eligible for help repairing all damage to their homes, not just the damage that makes it officially uninhabitable. Families would get up to $43,000 to make their homes stronger against the next disaster, and if home was a total loss, families could work with FEMA to actually rebuild it. On the public infrastructure side, state and local governments would get reimbursed within 120 days for emergency work to protect lives and property. For permanent rebuilding, like roads or bridges, schools or hospitals, state and local governments would get the money up front, and FEMA could only turn them down if there's evidence of fraud in the application. State and local governments could also build mitigation into the repair work from day one. That's just common sense and not something that FEMA allows today. If Washington State kept doing its part to prepare for disasters, which it has, it could get up to 85% of the cost to repair infrastructure covered by the federal government, freeing up state and local dollars for other investments in resilience and community services. The FEMA Act would also let homeowners get the money up front to raise or move their homes instead of forcing people already in crisis to pay out of pocket and hope for reimbursement later. Washington State would have a steady, predictable pre-disaster mitigation funding program because the FEMA Act makes BRIC a steady formula program. And the state could combine FEMA mitigation dollars with other federal grants to take on the bigger, smarter projects we need to deal with changing climate. And for the rest of the members on the committee, this wouldn't apply just to my state of Washington. All this would apply to your own states as well. These reforms needed to be in place before the December 2025 floods. They have to be in place before the next disaster hits. Congress has already waited a year too long, and today we will hear from witnesses with real experience in emergency management and related industries on what this reform would mean for them. So I want to thank you all for being here and look forward to your testimony. With that, yield back.
Again, want to thank you all for being here. I briefly want to take a moment to explain our lighting system. So green means go, yellow means you're running out of time, and red means please conclude your remarks. With that, I'd ask unanimous consent that the witness's full statements be included in the record, and without objection, that is so ordered. I'd ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may have been submitted to them in writing. Without objection, that is so ordered. I'd also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. And without objection, that is so ordered. As your written testimony has been made a part of the record, the committee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes, if you would. And with that, Mr. Fugate, who's the former FAA administrator, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson's members of committees, thanks for having me here. It's always fun to testify when you're not a government official. Nobody screened my testimony, nobody gave me talking points, and I generally ignored that. I want to be clear about this. This bill addresses concerns and issues I faced at FEMA. What's interesting is, Mr. Chairman, most of what you're proposing to do, with a couple exceptions, FEMA could always do. Because I always ask my attorneys, if it ain't illegal, why can't we do it? Well, we have policy against it. You know, there's nothing in the Stafford Act that says you can't pick up debris on private property. That's policy. We should not be duplicating what local and state governments would not normally do, so private roads and other things. But faced with the tornadoes in Joplin and Tuscaloosa, where I had debris fields that nobody could figure out whose house was on whose lot, and that by making everybody move it to the curb, we were going to not address the key issue, which was not picking up debris. It was about getting housing back. I had to go to the president and have him overrule OMB, because everybody blames FEMA. Trust me, there are many spoons in this pot. And OMB said you should not be picking up debris on private property. You should make them resolve their insurance claims to determine what the insurance would pay so we don't duplicate the benefit. Could you imagine doing that lot by lot if you ever saw the images of Joplin after an F5 tornado went and tore the heart out of that urban area? So we picked up debris on private property because the Stafford Act says it's not illegal. That was a policy decision. Being able to do estimates, you gave us that authority in Superstorm Sandy. We used it. Here's the situation. Vermont had a state building that flooded, but it didn't reach the magic threshold of 50%. So FEMA's policy was, we'll fix it where it stands. The state says, that doesn't make sense. It flooded. We need to move it. FEMA says, well, if you move it, you're going to get less money because we only pay actual cost. When you gave us the ability to do an estimate, we were able to go in, and Senator Leahy was very pleased with this. We negotiated with the state, we determined what the federal share, and again, this is the federal taxpayer's money. It's never been FEMA's money. The federal taxpayer would pay for the damages that were eligible in the full amount up front, and now the state could take the remaining part of moving it and do it, and they were successful. We were able to resolve the Water and Sewage Board in New Orleans, which we were doing by each mile, estimating what was pre-existing, caused by Katrina, and caused by deferred maintenance. We would have never been done. We used the estimate. We came up with a solution of using an engineering firm to come up with a methodology that both the state and FEMA agreed to. The IG reviewed it, Corps of Engineers reviewed it, and we were able to make a settlement and resolve that my last year at FEMA. An earthquake takes seconds. The paperwork shouldn't take decades. That's our situation. But the one thing in this bill I really want to point out, because it gets to some questions people have about insurance and other things, this committee doesn't have jurisdiction over insurance, and FEMA can't fix the insurance crisis we're facing. More and more people are underinsured or not able to get insurance. But giving FEMA the authority to repair homes, to get them back in the state where people can move back in is key. Because up until this point, we only had authority to shelter people. And trust me, we had bent ourselves into pretzels figuring out how to get people back in their homes under shelter authority. Because it's much cheaper to put somebody back in their home, even if it's $80,000 in repair, than to pay $300 to $400 a night for a hotel room in New York in Superstorm Sandy. It saved the public money, but we never had clear authority to do permanent repairs. HUD's got it, but that program took too long to get there. Our ability, instead of just putting a blue tarp on a roof or patching a house, of getting it back to where it's habitable and people can move back into it addresses another key concern this bill touches on. And that is, everybody talks about affordable housing. I'm not talking low income, I'm talking workforce housing. For communities where the workers are constantly being displaced because when homes are destroyed and rebuilt, new, usually it's priced out of the market. The rental properties go up, people don't have access to it. So this ability to give FEMA permanent authority to make repairs is key. In my state, I have a lot of seniors that are now going bare. They're not having insurance because they can't afford it. If their homes get destroyed, they have nothing, and FEMA's programs would make them whole. This bill gives them an opportunity to get those homes repaired and get back in them. So again, focus on the survivor, focus on the outcomes. Fraud, waste, and abuse has created more process and more bureaucracy, not creating what we hoped was reducing fraud, waste, and abuse, but creating a monster of a policy, bureaucratic recovery process. The earthquake takes minutes, the paperwork takes decades. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Next up, we have Ms. Lee Sheng, who's the president of Jefferson Parish in Louisiana, and she's here with the National Association of Counties. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for having me here today. My name is Cynthia Lee Sheng, and I serve as Parish President of Jefferson Parish, Louisiana. I'm here representing the National Association of Counties, where I serve as the co-chair of the Intergovernmental Disaster Reform Task Force. And among the many responsibilities entrusted to counties, we are on the front lines of disaster mitigation, response, and recovery. Roughly 900 counties experience at least one presidentially declared disaster each year. And in 2025, our nation faced 23 separate billion-dollar disasters that caused more than $115 billion in damages. Following a disaster, local elected officials and emergency managers were first on the scene, and we play a key role in recovery and rebuilding efforts so our residents can return to their lives as quickly as possible. As major owners and operators of public infrastructure, counties are uniquely positioned to mitigate the impacts of disasters. America's 3,069 counties, parishes, and boroughs own 44% of public roads, 38% of the national bridge inventory, 960 hospitals, and directly support 1/3 of our nation's airports. I'm here today to underscore the county role in strengthening our nation against disasters and to discuss how we can best work together to meet the challenges of today and the demands of the future. First, the FEMA Act provides a strong bipartisan framework to modernize the nation's disaster response and recovery system, and Congress should advance its core provisions without delay. Disaster response, recovery, and mitigation start local and they end local. However, these efforts would not be possible without continued support from federal programs through FEMA. One such program is in desperate need of reform is FEMA's Public Assistance Program. Public assistance is crucial for helping communities rebuild after disasters, but the lengthy reimbursement process can delay recovery and hinder our ability to restore critical services. In 2024, NACO conducted a survey of members that found that 1 in 5 counties' longest open public assistance claim has been in process between 4 and 6 years, and nearly a third have been open for more than 6 years. NACO strongly supports the FEMA Act's transition of the public assistance program from a reimbursement to a grants-based model, which would provide funding upfront and reduce counties' reliance on very costly borrowing. Second, streamlining disaster assistance and environmental review processes will cut red tape and speed recovery for survivors and local governments alike. Requiring the completion of complex and very burdensome paperwork by communities who are unfamiliar with the processes during the most stressful times of their lives can significantly impede progress when it is most needed. Populations that feel the biggest impact are often our underserved and disadvantaged communities who lack the resources and capacity to complete applications and meet critical deadlines. The FEMA Act addresses this directly by establishing a universal disaster assistance application and streamlining environmental and historic preservation reviews, reducing unnecessary delays while still maintaining strong protections. The Act's procurement waiver, which treats counties the same as states for federal contracting purposes, would also remove a significant obstacle to rapid disaster response. Finally, county officials are effective stewards of federal investments, and a strong intergovernmental partnership is needed to meet the entirety of our public sector responsibilities. Counties are not merely stakeholders in this conversation. Rather, we are part of the federal, state, and local partnership of governments that together share the responsibility of protecting our nation and its residents from disasters. And while disasters are inherently local, 45 states limit counties' ability to raise revenue, making the intergovernmental partnership vital to meeting our public sector responsibilities. We rely on our state and federal partners for critical recovery tools like funding, human capital, and technical assistance. In conclusion, counties stand ready to work side by side with you to improve our nation's disaster response, recovery, and mitigation capabilities to ensure the health, well-being, and safety of our citizens. Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, thank you again for the invitation to discuss this critical issue on behalf of America's counties. This concludes my testimony. I'm happy to accept questions later.
Thank you. Next up, we have Mr. Jim Matheson, who's the CEO of the National Rural Electric Cooperatives Association.
All right, Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson and members of the committee, I want to thank you for inviting me to testify on behalf of the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, or NRECA, which represents nearly 900 not-for-profit, community-owned electric cooperatives. Electric cooperatives operate in 48 states. We power 42 million people across 56% of the nation's landscape, including much of America's agricultural economy. Co-ops are owned and governed by the people they serve, and they operate at cost, helping keep electric rates affordable. And that affordability is especially important because electric cooperatives serve 92% of the persistent poverty counties in the country. So I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the vital relationship between FEMA and America's electric cooperatives and explain why NRECA strongly supports passage of the bipartisan Fixing Emergency Management for Americans, or FEMA Act. FEMA's public assistance program is a lifeline for electric cooperatives after natural disasters. Every year, co-ops lose poles, transformers, power lines, substations, and other critical infrastructure to ice storms, tornadoes, floods, hurricanes, wildfires, and other events. Nearly half of electric cooperatives have received FEMA public assistance since 2020. And because co-ops operate at cost, major recovery expenses cannot be absorbed through excess margins. Without federal support, those costs flow directly to rural families, farmers, and businesses through higher electric bills. And on average, electric cooperatives serve only 8 customers per mile, compared to 32 for other utilities. So FEMA assistance helps ensure that sparsely populated rural communities are not left to shoulder enormous recovery costs alone. But this is not just a rural issue. 433 of the 435 congressional districts have had a major disaster declaration in the past 15 years. While the FEMA co-op partnership is essential, it can work better. Funding approvals involving FEMA and state coordination often take years. Paperwork requirements are overly complex, and rules and interpretations vary by region. These delays slow recovery, strain rural systems, prolong outages, and increase costs for consumer members already facing tight budgets. NRECA strongly supports the FEMA Act because it offers specific, practical solutions to these problems. The bill includes reforms that are aligned with NRECA's 5 FEMA reform priorities that would make FEMA faster, more transparent, and more effective for cooperatives and the communities that depend on reliable and affordable electricity. First, the FEMA Act would better account for localized but costly rural damage. Many co-ops serve remote, sparsely populated areas where catastrophic storms may not meet state or county thresholds for disaster declarations, leaving consumer members to bear the full cost of rebuilding. Second, the bill would reduce the time required to receive public assistance. For emergency work, it would establish a 120-day reimbursement timeline so co-ops can restore power and remove debris without facing years of uncertainty. And for permanent work, it would create a streamlined upfront approval process for long-term repairs to critical electric infrastructure. Third, the bill also directs FEMA to reimburse loan interest when co-ops must borrow to rebuild while awaiting reimbursement, including for past storms, helping prevent financing costs from being passed on to our consumer members. Fourth, the FEMA Act would help co-ops rebuild stronger and more resilient systems. Hazard mitigation funds allow utilities to strategically harden or move infrastructure rather than simply replace what was damaged. And finally, the bill adds protections against costly FEMA de-obligations. Electric co-ops have a strong record of stewardship of taxpayer dollars, but arbitrary clawbacks years after a storm create uncertainty and they threaten affordability. NRECA greatly appreciates the committee's bipartisan work to include these 5 reforms in the FEMA Act. Rural America deserves a FEMA that's fast, transparent, and effective, and Congress should pass the FEMA Act quickly so rural families, farmers, and businesses are not left behind when the next disaster hits. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you. Next up, we have Mr. Brian Waller, who is the Vice President of Shelter Mutual Insurance Company, headquartered in Missouri, I might add. And he's here on behalf of the National Association of Mutual Insurance Companies. Thanks for being here.
Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. As you heard, my name is Brian Waller. I'm Vice President of External Relations at Shelter Insurance based out of Columbia, Missouri. I appear today on behalf of the National Association of Mutual Insurance Companies, or NAMIC. In May of last year, an EF3 tornado struck North St. Louis, destroying entire neighborhoods and causing more than $1.6 billion in damage. FEMA officials have called the residential damage the largest scale the agency has seen since the Joplin, Missouri tornado in 2011, which remains the costliest single tornado in U.S. history. For affected communities and victims in this and hundreds of other open declared disasters, FEMA is not just an idea, it is a lifeline. For Shelter and our fellow insurers, FEMA at its best is a trusted partner helping policyholders both before and after the storm. Unfortunately, more than a year after this storm, there is still much debris to be removed in North St. Louis, and we know that FEMA of recent years can do a better job serving the American people. Backlogs, delays, and duplicative processes have led to confusion and severe reputational harm at an agency that Americans need to know they can count on when disaster strikes. Secretary Mullen has taken important steps to correct the agency's course, and the President's FEMA Review Council has put forth thoughtful recommendations. However, legislative action is needed for lasting transformation, so we ask Congress to prioritize a more accountable and effective FEMA. I'm proud to be here today on behalf of the insurance industry to advocate for a reimagined FEMA that is committed to investing in mitigation before the storm, a simpler survivor experience, and accountability for results. The FEMA Act of 2025 that this committee overwhelmingly passed would accomplish these goals. NAMIC was pleased to endorse this legislation when it passed the committee in September and believe it a significant step in the right direction. Emergency management is most effective when all stakeholders are laser-focused on helping affected communities by bending the risk curve before and after storms. The insurance industry has a long history of working to advance solutions that reduce risk to our nation's housing and infrastructure by promoting investment to harden homes and communities against increasingly severe weather. A reimagined FEMA should likewise prioritize preparedness, building and rebuilding more resiliently, emphasizing common sense and cost-effective practices, encouraging up-to-date building codes, and bolstering retrofit programs to improve our existing housing stock and infrastructure. When disaster strikes, a reimagined FEMA should be focused on the experience of victims. No American should be left in limbo for weeks, months, or even years over inconsistent paperwork, requirements, especially after losing everything to a natural disaster. The FEMA Act contains practical and common sense solutions to many of the most pressing challenges facing the agency and American taxpayers. 6 particularly notable are restructuring and improving pre-disaster mitigation programs and establishing a formal process for peer-to-peer review, establishing a task force to address the backlog of open disasters, reducing impediments to prompt and effective debris removal, expediting permanent repair to public infrastructure, streamlining permitting and application processes, most importantly, creating a universal disaster application for survivors, and numerous GAO reports to ensure continued accountability. We all know that when it comes to natural disasters, it's a case of when, not if. But as noted at the outset, your actions regarding the future of this agency will have effects that provide meaningful help to Americans in need for years to come. We commend your leadership on these reforms. It has been said that emergency management works best when it is state-led, locally executed, and federally supported. We believe the FEMA Act will strengthen those partnerships between federal, state, and local governments, as well as other stakeholders, all in the interest of better serving taxpayers. The final report from the President's FEMA Review Council appropriately identified the need for legislation to implement many of its recommendations, and the FEMA Act tackles most of the issues outlined in that report. As this committee works with the House leadership, the Senate, the administration, and other stakeholders toward a final legislative product, we encourage swift action and urge the House leadership to bring the FEMA Act to the floor for passage in this Congress. I thank you for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Next up, we have Mr. Chuck Chaitovitz, and he is the Vice President, or one of the Vice Presidents, of the United States Chamber of Commerce. Thanks for being here.
Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I am Chuck Chaitovitz, Vice President for Environmental Affairs and Sustainability at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I appreciate the committee's bipartisan work on the FEMA Act and am pleased to be here alongside Chamber members and coalition partners who share a common goal, building smart, modern, resilient infrastructure so America is better prepared before the next crisis hits. The Chamber's message today is straightforward. Preparedness is pro-growth, and House action to pass the FEMA Act in short order is important in furthering progress. At the Chamber, our growth and opportunity imperative calls on policymakers to embrace a national goal of at least 3% annual real economic growth. Sustained 3% growth means higher wages, more jobs, stronger communities, greater competitiveness, and more opportunity for American families and businesses. It should also be a test for public policy. Policies that support growth should be advanced, and policies that do not should be rethought. Preparedness passes that test. A strong economy cannot be built on fragile foundations. Businesses cannot invest, hire, or serve the communities when roads are washed out, power is down, and local governments are forced to shift scarce resources from growth to recovery. Chamber research with Allstate and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation found that for every dollar invested into disaster preparedness, there are $13 in reduced losses and economic savings. A follow-on report showed the cost of inaction. Every dollar not invested in resilience today can cost communities up to $33 in future economic activity. The lesson is simple. We can pay less before disasters happen, or we can pay far more after they do. The FEMA Act moves our nation in the right direction by reinforcing preparedness and pre-disaster mitigation as central elements of national resilience. It recognizes that communities need predictable resources and stronger partnerships to reduce risk before disaster strikes. We need all the tools in the resilience toolbox to succeed. The Chamber supports a system that is locally driven, state managed, and federally supported. State and local leaders like President Sheng know their communities best, but empowering local leadership cannot mean weakening the federal role. A strong federal partner is essential to provide consistent funding, coordination across jurisdictions, and support for reducing risks that exceed local capacity. Pre-disaster mitigation must remain at the center of our shared priorities to modernize FEMA. The FEMA Act's formula-based approach offers a promising path forward to reliable funding for preparedness. The Chamber also supports the improvements made in the bill that make existing programs more practical and easier to use. Hazard mitigation programs should be strengthened. Too many communities face complex applications, burdensome requirements, and limited staff capacity. The FEMA Act makes important progress by allowing funding sources to be combined, supporting project consolidation, and improving permitting and environmental review. Speed and certainty matter in disasters. Finally, resilience is directly tied to housing affordability and family wealth. For many Americans, a home is often their largest asset. As Mr. Fugate said, when disaster destroys housing, families lose savings, workers are displaced, and employers face hiring challenges. Building and preserving more resilient and affordable housing protects families and strengthens local economies. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the committee, Congress has a choice: continuing paying more after disasters or invest smarter before they happen. The Chamber urges the House to pass the FEMA Act as soon as possible and preserve its focus on pre-disaster mitigation and public-private coordination. It will save lives and property. Resilience is not just good public policy, it's an economic imperative. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I'm happy to answer questions.
Thanks, everyone, for your testimony. We're now going to turn to questions, and I'm going to start off with Rick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it's kind of three buckets to disaster. There's the pre-disaster mitigation bit, there's the immediate response bit, and then there's the recovery and longer-term recovery bit, those three parts. The administration seems to want to focus strictly on, we'll help you with immediate response, but we're not going to really help on long-term recovery, and for Pete's sake, we don't want to help at all to help you build resiliently so that the impact of a disaster is less than what it could have been. What we try to do with the FEMA Act is say, no, all three parts need to exist, but we need to change. We need to change how we get that done, and that's been kind of the focus and the push here for the FEMA Act. Still, we have problems, and so I wanted to ask Mr. Fugate. This is the first question. FEMA is allowed to award up to $43,600 to survivors for home repair after disaster. The average award is about $4,000. Why is the average award such a small portion of what could be the maximum award in your experience?
It's based upon need, and that's a policy decision. I think this is one of the things that is clear in the Stafford Act when it was written. It was never intended to make families whole, and it was never intended to supplant the need for insurance. It was a safety net program. But as we've seen the crisis in insurance, where more and more people are uninsured, not able to afford insurance, renters don't generally have insurance. The program is based upon what we can determine when we go out there and assess them against the CFR, which is the regulations that were written to support this. And so many people hear the top number and assume that's what they're going to get and don't understand it's based upon actual losses in need. I would argue that that's semantics. The reality is, even if they got the full amount, it ain't going to make them whole. And I think that's one of the things to re-examine when we're talking about the survivors, is what exactly is the money supposed to do? Is it to make them whole? Is it to get them back in a home? Is it to provide housing assistance? I mean, think about it. We do temporary housing assistance. We'll spend $300,000 putting a trailer in there for 18 months. We could have rebuilt many homes for that. Maybe not with the granite countertops, but we could have done a good job. But I think this is one of the things you always run into is the friction. And this is within Congress. They don't want to reward people. They want to keep the cost minimal. They think they should be insured. And then the bureaucrats are stuck between one side that wants to make them whole and another side that wants to say it was their decision, their responsibility, they should have had insurance. And the bureaucrats have to figure that out. So yeah, sometimes we don't do a good job of it. But we're also dealing with, in many cases, the extremes. We shouldn't be paying and creating a hazard where people don't have insurance. But when Tom Ridge wrote the Stafford Act, most homes were insured. Most governments insured their fire stations. Today, very few governments are insured. They're self-insured, so the taxpayer pays for that loss. And increasingly, people cannot afford or get insurance. I'm from Florida. I know what it's costing. And I live in the interior of the state, and I know what it's costing. So I think a model that was based upon insurance, this bill, I mean, if nothing else, just being able to do the repairs. And again, it's only going to help those people that own their homes. It won't help the renters.
Thanks. Ms. Sheng, I'm a former county council member, so I understand how tight budgets can be at the local level, so I get where you're coming from. But how would the FEMA Act, have you looked at how the FEMA Act would help your parish invest more of its money for mitigation instead of cleanup?
I think one of the most critical elements for counties and local governments on the FEMA Act is getting the upfront funds. You know, right now, and especially if you're a small county, sometimes I speak to my colleagues, they're afraid to even sign a debris contract because they know that is beyond their budget when they get a terrible hurricane happening. So the upfront funds is critical. Right now, we're on a reimbursement model, which takes, as we said, years to happen. But if we can move to a formula-based upfront, give us those resources upfront, we can take that additional money and put it towards other needs. So when a community is broken, it's broken from the top to the bottom. We have to start with clearing debris out of roads, families aren't in homes, schools are damaged. It is overwhelming amount of loss that we're facing at the local level. And then another disaster on top of that is the financial disaster and the budgetary disaster that we face that you don't see. It's not on the television cameras, but it is very real to local governments, is not having the resources there. So the upfront payment for the assistance is very, very critical in this act for local governments.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Rizzo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for all our witnesses for being here today. I really appreciate it. As a native of the Mississippi Gulf Coast, I've seen firsthand in my former life as a law enforcement officer and local official how hurricanes, floods, and severe storms can be. Our communities are resilient, but they shouldn't have to spend years fighting federal bureaucracy to survive a disaster. Unfortunately, that's exactly what I've seen more than 2 decades after Hurricane Katrina. Communities in my district are still waiting on FEMA to complete projects and deliver on recovery commitments. And I know that they're not the only ones in this country. This is just something we've got to get past. It's unacceptable. Disaster survivors and local governments should not have to wait decades for the federal government to act. Time and again, we hear of the same complaints from local officials, emergency managers, and families trying to rebuild. FEMA takes too long to make decisions, too long to process applications, and too long to get communities the assistance Congress wants to give them. Delays drive up costs, slow recovery, and leave communities stuck in limbo. The problem isn't just that FEMA lacks the authority, it's that the system has become weighed down by unnecessary regulations, guidance, and paperwork. When disasters strike, we need an agency that can move at the speed of emergency, not at the speed of Washington. I'm encouraged by the efforts of the Streamline and with all of you here today in FEMA's process to reduce unnecessary bureaucracy and empower states and local communities to lead recovery with strong federal support. Those closest to the disaster know what their communities need, and FEMA should be a partner, not an obstacle. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about practical reforms that will hasten recovery, improve accountability, and ensure disaster assistance reaches our communities faster. Mr. Fugate, in South Mississippi, we still have communities waiting on FEMA-related projects from Hurricane Katrina, which hit us back in 2005. From your perspective, sir, what are the biggest bureaucratic obstacles that keep projects open for so long? And what reforms should make the biggest difference in getting these projects completed?
Well, it may sound flippant, but the biggest issue is preventing fraud, waste, and abuse. You know, all these regulations you hate, they came about because the IG found something and cited it and said, we got to take the money back. So you got to accept more risk for fraud and waste, because what we're doing to prevent fraud and waste is costing us a fortune, and it's not saving money. That's why I really appreciate the idea in this bill that we quit doing actual costs and just do estimates. Because I can go in there, and if you got a fire station and it got destroyed and you don't have insurance, if you had insurance, you'd have gone and got an insurance adjuster, you'd have gotten your money, and you'd been paid. 30 to 60 days, you're done. That's what this bill does.
Good.
It gets away from doing actual costs, project worksheets, versioning. I didn't know you could version a worksheet, all in the name of only paying the actual cost for the federal taxpayer. Well, all that's costing the taxpayer a fortune to administer it. Just get, and this is the other thing, half the stuff that people say FEMA can't do, I did. Mitch Landry was all upset after one of the hurricanes because he was going to have to borrow money to make payroll. I said, well, we'll give you the money. You can't do that. I said, yeah, we can do an estimate. You know that FEMA can estimate debris and emergency cost and get the money there? We did it in 30 days.
Thank you.
So what this bill does is it gives that authority in writing, and it eliminates actual cost and makes it all. Debris, we should be doing debris as an estimate, not by the cubic yard or the lot.
That's it.
Give you the money, let you pick it up, make the decision.
Thank you. Ms. Sheng, as a local official in Louisiana, next to me, you've worked hard directly with FEMA and after disasters. What parts of the FEMA process create the most delays for your local government?
I think similar to what Mr. Fugate is discussing, the initial process in trying to estimate things takes a lot of staff capacity that you know, we can manage okay in Jefferson Parish. We happen to be the largest parish in the state, but for some smaller counties, they just don't have the staff, they don't have the expertise to navigate through some of these application processes. And I think when we just make it much more simpler and have the rules on a formula-based, I think that will greatly help local capacity to be able to navigate these issues.
And you know, most all local officials and people, they just want to get back to life. And, you know, anything that we can do to help, you know, that's exactly what we want to do. And I want to be a part of the solution, not the problem. So thank you all for those
Thank you.
good answers. Thank you.
Mr. Garamendi.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And for the witnesses, I'm really upset by all of you because you keep coming back to something that I swore that I'd never pay any attention to, and that's insurance. I spent 8 years of my life as the insurance commissioner in California, and the connection between the FEMA programs that you've been discussing and the insurance problems are so severe that we have to deal with both of them. And if we don't, we're not going to deal with either of them very, very well. There are many, many ways. In 1990, we were looking at developing a national natural disaster insurance program. And we figured out how we could pay for that, how it could be done by the federal government. Hasn't happened yet. But until we connect these two, the insurance problem, which is discussed here and which is a very, very real problem in California and really across the nation, we will not be able to solve the FEMA problem unless we consider FEMA to be the ultimate insurer, which is pretty much where we're headed. And in that regard, it's not a very good way to deal with it because it doesn't assess the risk at the outset. An insurance program properly structured can assess the risk and force the homeowner, in this case, to not only know the risk, but to pay for the risk at that particular home. Very complex, but I'm going to put that on the table for my first, minute and a half here. We've got to do both of these things, and I noticed a couple of smiles from the insurers down there. Now, putting that aside, I'm going to go back to where I'm really not upset with all of you. You really did exactly what you're supposed to do. I want to go back to where FEMA is really out of bounds, and that is the current FEMA program is being used to support the immigration enforcement by the federal government. This is wrong, it's contrary to law, and it's creating a very profound problem. FEMA should not be assisting ICE. The FEMA staff reduced by 5,000 in the DOJ cuts. What's left is now being used to run the detention facilities, now being used to set up the programs for the ICE agents to do a raid now in Maine and wherever else around the nation. This is wrong. It's contrary to law. And this committee has the responsibility of holding the Trump administration accountable for the misuse of FEMA and use of FEMA to carry out the various programs that the president wants on immigration enforcement. It's not that the immigration enforcement effort is short of money. Good Lord, they have $120 billion to spend in the next couple of years. Bring FEMA back. This committee ought to demand that FEMA no longer be engaged with ICE in the immigration enforcement program. Let ICE take care of itself, and there's plenty of problems there, and I certainly share those concerns and would rally around. The second thing is the politicization of FEMA. It's been reported, most recently in Politico, on the 7th of this month, that the Trump administration has singled out states that are Republican-run, Republican senators, Republican governors, and provided them with immediate assistance. And those states that are Democratic senators, Democratic governors, have been denied assistance. The politicization of FEMA by the president and his minions is absolutely wrong. And this committee ought to hold the administration to account on that, as well as to these other issues. It's got to stop. Now, I'd be happy to discuss with anybody here the insurance issues and how we might be able to deal with that, but that's offline, and come to my office and I'll give you ideas that date back 30 years on how to deal with it. But the politicization and the misuse of FEMA by this administration is wrong, it is illegal, and this committee has to hold the president and his programs to account. With that, Mr. Chairman, I beg you to do that, to force the administration to come here and to testify under oath how they are abusing FEMA in carrying out their immigration programs. I yield back.
Mr. Webster.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Matheson, what is pre-staging or pre-positioning, and why is it critical for those activities to happen when performing or getting ready to perform utilities during storm activities? And why hasn't FEMA been willing to reimburse that?
Pre-positioning is where we know a hurricane or a storm's coming, and our job is to get the lights on as fast as we can. And often what you want to do is you want to move crews into areas so they're ready to go right when the storm passes, so we can start restoration work as soon as possible. It's part of a process where utilities, the electric cooperatives, have what's called mutual assistant, where we bring line workers in from all over the country to go to these places where these natural disasters are happening. And if we can pre-position in advance, we can get the lights on that much sooner. And for all the other impacts of a natural disaster, having the lights back on is very helpful for dealing with all the other damage assessment and all the other recovery work that has to take place. So pre-positioning gives us a leg up in terms of getting the lights on faster, and it should be a part of the reimbursement program at FEMA. This legislation, we believe, puts it in a position to make that happen. I think it's a legitimate part of how we do disaster recovery. I'm really glad you raised the issue, because pre-positioning is a critical part of how we get the lights on as timely as we can.
Very much. So, parametric modeling, what is it? How does it work?
I may not be the expert on parametric modeling, but that was one of the recommendations of the President's Review Council. We have concerns with that. We have concerns about an arbitrary model that may not be reflecting what is actual damage on the ground. That's the way we ought to be looking at damage. And we have situations where wind speed may not be where it triggers the model to say, okay, that qualifies reimbursement, but you may have a combination of wind and flooding that creates huge damage to the electric infrastructure, and we're gonna have some model that says, nope, doesn't qualify, you're out. That doesn't make sense to us, and that's not in the FEMA Act, but it is in the Review Commission's report, and we have concerns with that because we think it's going to create arbitrary situations where damage that should be subject to FEMA reimbursement is denied because of that model.
So there are some states that use it at the local level when they're considering reimbursements for natural disasters. But why is it controversial?
Because when you take a model that says based on X amount of miles per hour wind speed, and that's going to trigger whether or not the disaster is eligible for recovery or not, that doesn't necessarily reflect what happens to a power line, though a power line magically falls when it's 51 miles an hour and doesn't at 49 miles an hour. That's the problem with this model. Actual damage is how we should be making these decisions, not based on some model with some standard of what the wind speed was to say, okay, that's why you should pay for the disaster.
How would it affect rural electrics or even electric co-ops and municipal utilities?
Well, first of all, you're adding another element of uncertainty. You may very well put electric cooperatives in a position where there's significant damage, but the model says, nope, doesn't qualify, and we're left, as I said in my opening statement, shouldering the burden where we are at-cost utilities representing 92% of the persistent poverty counties in America. We don't have shareholders to fall back on, and we have very sparsely populated areas. So you have several miles of electric line, but not many people to spread that cost across because we're in these sparsely populated areas. That's why we're eligible for FEMA participation in the first place. That's what Congress decided decades ago. And if we go to this model that has some arbitrary function that says, well, even though you had all this damage, the model doesn't say it qualifies, I don't think that's what we're looking for here. I think we're looking for reasonable people to assess the situation, look at the damage, and say, yeah, that qualifies. And so that's our resistance with the parametric, with the model that you're talking about.
Well, what other additional FEMA reforms could be included beyond just expediting reimbursements?
Well, I think that the FEMA Act has 5 critical reforms that we think are important, including the 120 days for the initial assistance. It has the opportunity for hazard mitigation funds in a more targeted way that makes sense for building resilient systems. It allows for interest reimbursement if electric co-ops are stuck for years waiting for payment from FEMA and they accrue significant burden there. There are provisions in this bill that we highly endorse. We think it's the right step to take, and we think the chairman and ranking member and the full committee have done a great job of looking at all these issues, taking information from, as the chairman said in his opening statement, dozens and dozens of different stakeholders. It's a great way to make legislation, in my opinion, and that's why we're so supportive of the bill as it's written today.
Thank you very much. Yield back.
Mr. Stanton.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and for holding this important hearing on the urgent need to pass the FEMA Act. This is a proud bipartisan committee, and both Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson have longstanding commitment and have provided leadership in the effort to strengthen FEMA. Both of them know how important it is to help Americans in their darkest hours, and that's why this effort is very important. Recently, as Ranking Member of the Economic Development, Public Buildings and Emergency Management Subcommittee, I released an investigative report that details how the Trump administration and DHS leadership are misusing FEMA resources for ICE operations, jeopardizing FEMA's readiness and ability to respond to disasters. This important investigation found that FEMA personnel have been utilized to plan deportation raids and arrest, recruit new ICE and CBP officers, and manage day-to-day operations at detention facilities. Of course, FEMA was built on a promise to the American people. When disaster strikes, the federal government will be there. Unfortunately, that promise too often has been broken. Since the start of the current administration, the agency has lost more than 20% of its workforce, more than 5,000 key employees. Its training pipelines, key to ensuring readiness before disaster strikes, has been severed. Its disaster declaration process has too often been politicized, denying communities needed support, and its hazard mitigation programs have been dismantled. This is on top of the fact that personnel have been detailed for extended periods for immigration enforcement operations. Whether or not you agree with the current administration's mass deportation policy, this report makes one thing clear. We need an agency that is capable and ready to serve our constituents when they need it most, and that is less likely to happen if FEMA continues to remain inside of Department of Homeland Security. Former Administrator Fugate, have you had an opportunity to review the investigative report I referenced?
I've had a summary of it, sir.
Do you think FEMA should help ICE coordinate arrests, raids, and deportations?
Well, the question is, you gave that authority to the Secretary under the Homeland Security Act. You got to change that.
How would an independent agency, which is what the FEMA Act proposes, protect employees from being pulled into non-Stafford Act missions?
Well, if you're not part of Homeland Security, then the Secretary's authority to transfer staff wouldn't apply. But it went both ways. In Superstorm Sandy, we transferred about 2,000 DHS employees to help us in that response. But these were always meant to be temporary. In the Obama administration, we were tasked with supporting undocumented children. We had a crisis that was backed up. Kids were in detention facilities, never designed to hold children. They were designed to hold adults. In those, we worked the mission. We had the authority and authorization of the other components, including Health and Human Services. And that was a big problem with those because it was divided between 2 departments. But the question is, would FEMA be better off being independent? I never thought FEMA should be in DHS, but when I testified at my hearing, I said yes, because here's the other thing. You made the FEMA administrator an E2. Does anybody know what that means outside of the people that read the plum book? The FEMA administrator is the same rank as the service secretaries, the EPA administrator, the SBA administrator, yet they're treated as a subcomponent in DHS. Secretary and deputy secretary were surprised to find out I was an E2 because they were trying to get all their components promoted to E3s. And somebody said, well, I don't think the administrator wants a demotion. Even the Department of Defense would have me summoned to go meet with assistant secretaries, which were an E5 and I was an E2. And I'm like, I ain't going over there, they can come see me. It wasn't arrogance, but the thing I've learned is if you give us authority and we don't execute it, we lose it. And I think part of what we have done is we have diluted the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act to recognize that the FEMA administrator is the same rank as the Navy secretary. It's not treated that way in DHS.
I think in a bipartisan way, we agree with that this needs to be an independent agency with direct line to the President of the United States. It will save time on declaration, emergency management proclamations. It'll save time in emergency response and make the whole process much quicker, which is exactly what the American people expect. Do you think, Mr. Fugate, if FEMA were to become an independent agency, would that help restore public trust in FEMA to operate effectively in response to disasters?
No. I think FEMA executing the mission is what restores that trust. You know, when I got to FEMA, we were dealing with post-Katrina, and everybody says, you know, are you going to fail? You know, tell us you're not. And I'm like, I can't tell you that. I have to execute. You'll determine if we failed or we didn't. Again, I caution people, just moving things around, reorganizing is not the answer. The answer is empowering FEMA to make sure they have the right leadership and the tools to execute. But their ability to regain the public trust doesn't matter where they sit. It matters where they execute and how it's perceived by the public of doing the mission. Independently, I think, as you point out, it relieves a lot of the hurdles, but quite honestly, I worked under that system. I just cheerfully ignored most of it because the law said I work for the president, and I report to the president, and the secretary was responsible for making sure I showed up to work and I took my vacation time. Well, I didn't get vacation time, I was a political appointee. But the reality is, I made it work because I've always been in that situation, but it is personality-based. And so when you have a secretary in there that does not see the FEMA administrator as the principal advisor, as the law says, to the president, the National Homeland Security Council, and the secretary in that order, and that I got there, we were routing declarations for the secretary's office. I said, why? Well, that's the way they want it. I'm like, I don't care. The law says I'm the principal advisor and I'm advising the president. I make a recommendation on to declare or not declare. To me, the law says that goes to the president. We changed it. Trust me. There are a lot of people at DHS, and not so much the secretary, but all of the offices around there that really wanted to get into our business. And I fought it. I just said no. I was arrogant and I was pragmatic, but I went to the law, and I knew that if we did not execute what the law said, we were going to lose that authority. So I was a pain to a lot of people, but that shouldn't be the way it has to be.
I'm over time, and that's a really well-made point that moving things around could help reduce bureaucracy, but it's the people and the support from the president that makes all the difference. That's a good point. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Perry.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to our panelists. I just want to kind of level set here and remind everybody that's listening to the hearing today that regardless of all the wailing and gnashing of teeth of the utilization of FEMA personnel, under the previous administration, FEMA personnel were used to bring people illegally across the border. And I remember in this committee room asking about the regional director for the Pennsylvania region being moved to the border for specifically that. So let's just level set here and make sure that we have all the facts. This is not a one-way street, and there are infractions that irritate both sides to be considered here. I'm just going to turn to you, Director Fugate. In your written testimony, you say that H.R. 4669 is the first significant effort in the Stafford Act to price disaster risk honestly rather than simply paying for it faster, and I think that's a quote. This is largely as a result of the sliding scale for the federal cost shares for disaster assistance based on state action or inaction in risk mitigation that is included in the FEMA Act and was suggested by the President's FEMA Review Council. My understanding is that you proposed this idea during your time as FEMA administrator. I think it's good to see folks coalescing around this idea to get states to have some more skin in the game and to ensure that we do everything we can on the front end to mitigate the risk rather than throwing money at the problem after the fact. Can you take a moment to elaborate on the advantages of this proposal and what other ideas you might have to get to states to play a bigger role in disaster mitigation, especially up front?
Well, I'm going to take advantage since we have the International Code Council here is states that have strong building codes and build for the environment have less losses. States that don't have strong building codes, and everybody says, well, it's red tape, but we know that the stronger it is, and this comes from the state of Alabama. The more you invest, and they use a program that the Institute of Business Home Safety does, Fortify, where they build above the code. The homes have done better, and they've documented it, and it saves them money. But I always want to remember, this ain't FEMA's money. This is the taxpayers' money. Why should the taxpayer continue to pay for the state and local governments who are making decisions to grow risk, and there's no containment?
Well, I agree with you. As a matter of fact, why should any government pay? I mean, what incentive do people have to buy insurance if the federal government's going to rush in and pay for everything that happens under the sun, whether it gets too hot, it gets too cold, the water rises, the wind blows? I mean, that's the attitude these days.
And that's the challenge. That's why, again, when Tom Ridge wrote this, it was based upon insurance was the primary model. Local governments insured their buildings. Most of the public had insurance. We have an insurance crisis. We're going to have to navigate that. But by using a sliding scale that says, right now it's like, I win the lottery. If I get to that magical threshold, I get 75% of all my costs back to the first dollar. Do you know any insurance policy that doesn't have a deductible?
Right. Exactly.
So if you get to that magic threshold, you get it all there.
Bad behavior.
And there's no containment, there's no incentive for states to make investments, there's no incentive to, maybe we shouldn't be building there the way we're building and hoping somebody else will pick up the check, because that's the taxpayer, that's federal taxpayer. So I think this bill, by saying, look, we're going to do this gradually. I find that when we try to do the sudden shocks, it never works. But we're going to start out gradually. If you're not doing anything to manage your risk, you're just building wherever you want to, and you're not doing anything to protect the federal taxpayer from exposure, you're at 65%. If you are now doing those things, you're enforcing building codes, you're insuring your public buildings, you're doing those things to reduce the cost to the federal taxpayer, you may get to 85%. That's the first time we've incentivized reducing the cost to the federal taxpayer by before the disaster, not waiting for somebody else to pay for it, but taking the actions to build and manage their risk without necessarily depending upon the federal government as the first payee.
I appreciate it, and with little time I have, we talked, and I think I know your position on separating FEMA from the Department of Homeland, but can you speak to the importance of having an independent inspector general to keep FEMA honest about its efficiency and effectiveness? Sir.
Well, I think an independent IG, it depends on what you want them to look at. Separating FEMA, having the IG, it's a symbiotic relationship. If it's an accounting error, I agree with the IG. But one of the things you got to remember the IG does is they look at policies. And most of the time when they say FEMA takes the money back, it ain't FEMA. It's the IG finding FEMA didn't find policy and they should take the money back. Those clawbacks that are devastating. So I think if you're going to have an independent IG, you need to make sure they're not the IG for a standard agency. They're going to have to assume that there's more risk being made to get money out the door and that we're not running an accounting business. We're in the business of helping communities recover. So if you're going to do an independent IG, they're going to have different rules of engagement.
That's fine, but I mean, yeah, you get the money out the door, but that doesn't mean that just because we're getting the money out the door because there's a disaster that we just throw money away and accept that as the that's the cost of doing
business. But I think this is the common issue. If you want to go fast, you're going to take risk. And if those risks were honest and there was no fraud, I think we have to accept there's going to be additional cost. But I'm pretty sure it's cheaper than what it's costing us to try to make sure we have no fraud and abuse. And we're sitting there counting by cubic yards. I mean, do you know how we do debris? We have a contractor picking up debris. Then we have to hire a separate contractor to monitor the contractor that's picking up debris to determine how many cubic yards are actually in the truck. Then we have to have the state monitoring the contractor, monitoring the debris company. Then we have to have FEMA monitoring the state. And then the IG comes in there and they say, we're here to help. It would be a lot cheaper just to do an estimate and be off 5% either way and get it done, and we'd save money because we wouldn't be doing all the overhead.
I yield.
Ms. Strickland.
Thank you, Chairman Perry and Ranking Member Stanton, for holding this hearing, and thank you to Administrator Fugate for your unapologetic candor about what needs to be done to improve FEMA. I want to shift gears a bit and talk about FEMA's non-disaster grant programs. Part of FEMA's mission is to prevent and respond to imminent, threatened, or actual acts of terrorism. To carry out that mission, FEMA administers critical public safety and preparedness grant programs, including the Homeland Security Grant Program, or HSGP. On June 24, 2026, FEMA and DHS published the fiscal year 2026 Notice of Funding Opportunity that holds back 20% of funds if states do not submit to President Trump's voter election interference tactics. DHS and FEMA are now politicizing $200 million of federal funds to fight terrorism by forcing states to implement partisan election policies that in some case violate court orders, the Constitution, and existing state laws. And when we passed the FEMA Act of 2025 into law, it did include not politicizing FEMA and how funds are distributed. So Administrator Fugate, you served as FEMA Administrator for almost a decade. Can you please explain what counterterrorism or preparedness objectives are served by conditioning these grants on compliance with potentially unlawful election requirements?
It's furthering the administration's policies. It's as simple as that. FEMA is just a tool here. I mean, if you ask FEMA, they wouldn't do it. They're being directed to do it. And right now, until the courts rule, they're giving the president a lot of executive authority. So the only way you're going to contain that is putting specific language in the law that says you can't do that. And then the judges can look at that and go, yeah, that's not executive authority. Congress has clearly said no. But the Supreme Court and many justices have ruled the president has executive authority. FEMA is not doing this because they think it's a good idea. They're being directed to do it. And this is the administration asserting their authority as they have it for policy. And until the courts determine which is right, it's going to happen. I think that, again, I find that a lot of times FEMA gets thrust in there. Like, FEMA is just a tool being used to advance an administrative policy.
Yeah.
Don't yell at FEMA. It's just, we're convenient, but don't yell at FEMA. This is what they're doing. And so far, there's not been tremendous pushback from the courts, especially the Supreme Court, that they don't have that executive authority.
Yeah, following up, during your time as FEMA Administrator, did you consider how a state runs its elections as criterion for awarding these funds?
Not for those funds, for recovery funds. I dealt with it, I seem to be the person that always had disasters in the middle of presidential elections, which we found out you cannot postpone. So we actually supported the state of New Jersey in funding temporary polling sites, bringing in generators, tents, and other things to conduct the election. That's an appropriate use of FEMA. We supported, we didn't have anything to do with staffing it. We supported the state to carry out the election. That was eligible under protective measures. We did that in Florida during the election in 2004, where we built polling stations because in Charlotte County, there was nothing left to do polling in. So we had to build that. That's an appropriate role for FEMA.
Yeah, so basically your job was to respond to a disaster to allow elections to be carried out as they're supposed to be by law.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. And I just want to, end this by saying this is not just about FEMA and DHS exploiting a counterterrorism grant for a purpose unrelated to stopping terrorism. This is about an administration weaponizing FEMA for voter suppression. And as I often say, the United States does not have a voter fraud problem. We have a voter participation problem. In 2024, 90 million people did not participate in our elections. They chose not to vote. This is a bad solution. It does nothing to help promote democracy. It's unconstitutional, and the safety of the American people are not enhanced because of these actions. I yield back, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Fong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this important hearing. Mr. Fugate, I would like you to, outline, do you believe that moving to upfront project-based grants will reduce the cost of rebuilding following a disaster?
Yeah, that's an easy one.
Can you go into specifics in terms of how we can, and kind of give me some real-world examples?
Okay, let's use a fire station. Everybody gets a fire station. You know what a fire station is? It's a building, right? It's also a function. So let's say you have a flood or a hurricane or a wildfire and the fire station gets destroyed. If you had insurance, what would be the first steps you would take? Contact the insurance. They send out an adjuster. They determine the building was destroyed. They look at the insured value. They write you a check. You go build a fire station. How hard is that? The current system is FEMA goes out there and first has to determine that the fire station was destroyed because of the disaster. Then they have to determine if there was any disaster causes that would have increased the cost, like deferred maintenance and stuff. Then they have to determine, well, what's the value of the building and contents? And then what would it take to replace that? And they write an estimate on that, and that's a project worksheet. But because they do actual cost, they don't give them the money. The local governments now have to go get a contractor to go build a fire station. They have to get an estimate. They have to submit that to FEMA for being reviewed. Well, they want to change because the station was too small. They want to build it bigger. Well, FEMA says, we're only going to replace what was there. That's on you. We ain't going to approve that. But that's a change we have to approve on that. You can have as many as 10 versions on that worksheet getting to the final answer, and then you're reimbursing them. So what the locals have to do is they have to borrow the money, issue a bond to go build that fire station. They don't have the cash, and they generally don't have that much money sitting around. And this process will take the entire process of just getting to approval a year or more, and then up to 5 years of changes and everything else. It doesn't take 5 years to build a fire station. So by going to an estimate, here's how it would work. We get there, everybody agrees it's destroyed. Now, those of you that are concerned about fraud, waste, and abuse, here's what the thing requires. They have to get an engineer or architect of license in their state to put in their estimate of what that is. Because everybody's afraid, well, it won't be enough money or there'll be things they discovered later. I said, well, that's why you got them putting their seal on there, because they have insurance, and if they didn't get it right, that's where you get your money, not the taxpayer. We agree to it, 75% of them. We issue it. We put it in Smart Link, it goes down, state's got the money, they issue it to them. They now have the cash to go build a fire station. That's the difference.
We have a situation in my district, and maybe you can shed some light into this, where road gets washed out. It gets washed out every single time there's a flood. The community wants to build it to a higher standard, but because of the rules, you have to build it to what existed pre-disaster. Would it make sense to allow the community to fix it permanently and build it to?
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the things is looking at cost-benefit analysis. I don't think we ought to be putting culverts back in anywhere. We ought to be doing box culverts. I've never seen a culvert that you put in after a flood that survives the next flood. I mean, it's just dumb stuff we do to try to keep it cheap. We ought to be going in there and not looking at what the road was before. We ought to be looking at the function of the road and going, how much does it cost every time that road gets washed out? And that should be the basis of the estimates. Just like we were building that fire station. I had fire stations and Hurricane Charlie got wiped out in that storm. To build them back to the building code was stupid because they got wiped out being built to the building code. I needed to build them for Cat 5. They said, well, it's not worth the cost-benefit analysis. I said, what about the function of the fire station? Oh, that changes the equation. Yeah. So I don't disagree, but guess what? This is getting people to think differently. A road is not a construction project. It's a function. What is the cost of losing that function? Wouldn't it make more sense to spend 10 to 15% more to ensure the function is there after the disaster instead of fixing it again?
That makes perfect sense to me. Mr. Matheson, I wanted to ask you, in your experience, which regulations or policies could FEMA eliminate to reduce delays for utilities, such as rebuilding poles, substations, and transmission infrastructure after disaster has occurred?
I think the legislation creates greater certainty in terms of time frame. For the initial assistance, the 120-day limit, that would be a big help for us in terms of moving quickly with greater certainty when we're trying to repair storm damage. I mean, some of these repair projects like building a fire station, we've heard that takes time. We want the electric system up immediately if we can. And so the ability to move quickly, to make quick decisions, that's in all of our interest to have the lights on for people when they're dealing with all the other impacts of the disaster.
Thank you for that. I'm running out of time. Mr. Chair, I yield back, but thank you for the panel.
Ms. Sykes, you're right.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and to the ranking member for holding this hearing today. As we are in the midst of disaster season, many Americans are concerned if disaster strikes in their communities, the support that they need to survive and rebuild may not be available to them. 2 years ago, my community in Northeast Ohio was hit by back-to-back storms in a 3-day span that caused widespread flooding. I led a letter with the bipartisan delegation from Northeast Ohio calling on the governor to reach out to FEMA for emergency assistance. During this hour of dire need, my constituents turned to the federal government to help rebuild, and FEMA was there to deliver, and for that we are grateful. That is why I'm deeply concerned about the cuts that are being made by the Trump administration during the president's second term, drastically curtailing FEMA's ability to respond to other communities in crisis. Under this administration, FEMA's preparedness and mitigation grants have been severely delayed or canceled altogether, failing to give states the resources they need to prepare for disasters, hire staff, and harden the infrastructure that would keep Americans safe. Also, since January 2025, disaster declaration requests from Democratic governors have been approved at a rate of 23% compared with 89% for Republican-led states, clearly showing preferential treatment. And I've heard from many of you in your testimony about the impact of delays, but didn't hear a whole lot about the impact of denials for these Democratic states. Politicizing disaster assistance hurts American families, and to make matters worse, a recent report by one of the subcommittees on this full committee also found that DHS is siphoning FEMA resources to support ICE's deportation campaign, diverting essential resources away from FEMA's disaster response. So in a word, FEMA is a disaster. In a recent raid on Ohio voting rights organization, DHS agents raided the organization's office in Northeast Ohio and went to volunteers' homes across the state to question them without a warrant. This is an example of voter suppression and intimidation, but also an egregious misuse of DHS resources in my home state that we still don't have an accounting for. And so I can't help but notice that there are no current FEMA employees or administrators with us today, and I am sure that is not a coincidence. And I imagine, Mr. Fugate, that is why you are so popular today, to stand in and speak for those who refuse to or could not, or for whatever reason, not here to answer questions on behalf of the American public. But glad that you're here. But I do want to ask you, what is the operational impact of cutting off staff and siphoning resources from FEMA to ICE, for ICE? And how will this loss impact FEMA's readiness to respond to a disaster?
It's all very subjective how you look at it. Now, I go back to the original issue. You gave the Secretary this authority in the Homeland Security Act.
I did not give the Secretary that.
And that's
some
the
other
problem.
people did.
You've given discretion, and when you have discretion, it can be used for good and bad, for things you don't agree with, but they have the discretion. That, I think, either making FEMA independent or being more specific in the language around FEMA, limiting or eliminating that. But until you do that, you've given them that, whether you agree with it or not, they have that authority. What you would have to do to demonstrate they've broken the law is you gave them percentages they could move. And if they're moving them at a greater percentage, or they're violating the Economy Act, which means they're spending money they weren't authorized or appropriated for. But until you get there and you gave the Secretary authority to move money around, I mean, in my administration, when we did our budgets, I ended up losing money to go pay for a security cutter for Coast Guard. So as long as there's discretion, it can be used for good or for things you don't agree with.
Thank you for that, but that was not what I was inquiring of you. It was whether or not that is a good use of resources. And that is not
Has
suggested.
FEMA not been able to respond to a disaster because of that? And the answer is no, but we haven't had a big disaster, so I don't know.
Well, I think that that is certainly up to interpretation, as 89% of Republican states are even getting a disaster declaration, while 23% of Democrat states are not. So I think perhaps the premises that you are basing that analysis on are flawed. You did mention FEMA becoming an independent agency, so there is an attempt to do that. And I've also heard you talk about in your testimony today the need for FEMA to take more risks at the expense of fraud, waste, and abuse. And considering this current administration, do you think that they would do that in order to be more responsive to the American public?
Yeah, I try to get past the talking points and the rhetoric and all the noise out there. And I got to this point where I said, what I've heard is they want to get the money down with the least amount of overhead. How do you do that? I think this bill gives them that tool. You do the estimate, you get them the money. I think what they're really, and this is something I don't think anybody's been disagreeing with, is why does it take decades and the cost to administer that dollar is costing in many cases more than that dollar?
Well, some of it is because the president is refusing to help people who are in need. So thank you for your testimony. I'm really sorry that one of your colleagues from the current FEMA are not here, and they're leaving you to hold the bag at the expense of the American public. Thank you for being here.
Mr. Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, Mr. Matheson, I was just sitting here thinking, I know we got redistricted, but I still think I can claim that I've got more electric co-ops in the 10th District of Georgia than the other districts that represent Georgia, and proud of it. But I want to go over some things with Hurricane Helene. As you know, Hurricane Helene and many other recent storms have taken a serious toll on Georgia. In fact, Georgia's Electric Membership Corporation outages from Helene totaled about 435,000 customers. One of the hardest hit co-ops in my district was Washington EMC, which had 86% of its members out during an extensive restoration effort. It's my understanding the co-op had about $16 million in Helene damages alone, which is a lot of money and far more costly than previous storms. One of the improvements in the FEMA Act over the status quo is getting these reimbursements back to co-ops and counties and cities a lot faster. Can you talk about how some new timelines and deadlines for FEMA would be helpful for my constituents back home in Georgia?
Sure, I appreciate that. And Georgia, incidentally, has more consumers served by electric cooperatives than any state in the country. So I'm not surprised you have a lot of cooperative members in your district as well. Helene was a significant storm and affected many states, Georgia being one of them, and the damage was severe. $16 million may not sound a lot to a large investor-owned utility, but for an electric cooperative at a local level, that's a lot of money. And so I appreciate you raising that as a specific example. And making these decisions about moving ahead, getting the public assistance grant quickly, that's how we get started. And this legislation creates a 120-day timeline to make that happen. That will be very helpful for electric cooperatives in terms of reducing risk, allowing them to move forward with what they need to be doing, which is restoring power. The second issue is for the longer-term components of funding. There are times when co-ops are stuck for years holding loans to cover the cost before they get reimbursed by FEMA, and the interest continues to accrue. And this legislation allows for interest reimbursement to be part of FEMA reward in the future. Now, historically, FEMA has done that in some cases, but it's been really inconsistent where loan interest is reimbursed and where it isn't. And this legislation creates greater certainty in that context, and that will be a significant risk reduction for electric cooperatives as well. So those are a couple of the items that are going to be really helpful for those circumstances.
Yeah, and you know, I toured the 10th District and even outside the 10th District when Helene hit. And just the massive undertaking, the setting up of base camps, of co-ops moving in to help, and the teamwork. It is a huge undertaking and a very expensive undertaking to make sure that people get their power back on in a timely manner. So, and it was a good job.
No question. Those are linemen that come from all over the country to come and help from other electric co-ops. It's one of the hallmarks of the electric cooperative movement is this mutual aid where when disaster strikes, we go help each other out. And so Georgia had a significant participation from folks all over the country to come and help restore the power.
Yes, sir. And that leads into my second question for Mr. Fugate. I'm sorry. I think I pronounced that right. We have also heard of situations where FEMA required contractors to provide to the EMC that FEMA is auditing their pay rates for their employees before FEMA would reimburse the EMC for using a contractor. In what world is a contractor who competes with EMCs and IOUs for linemen, are they going to want to provide their pay rates?
Well, it's actual cost, sir. That's the problem. We got to have the actual cost. You got to submit the documentation. Doing estimates gets around that.
Okay, but I'm sure you see my point, though, right?
Oh, no, sir, I understand perfectly, but you want FEMA to do actual cost. We need the numbers.
Yeah.
Do an estimate, FEMA don't need the numbers.
Yeah. Okay, all right, well, I appreciate it, and you'll back. I think I will.
Ms. Shelton.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ranking Member Larson, for holding this really, really important meeting. I can't really think of anything more pressing right now than a hearing entitled Reforming FEMA, Ensuring the Nation's Disaster Readiness Works for Americans. Just going quickly down the line, just to clarify, Mr. Fugate, are you currently employed by FEMA?
No, I'm a citizen.
Sheng? No. Matheson?
I am
no, you're not. Okay, no. No. So no one currently working for FEMA is here to talk about how we reform FEMA. I am so grateful to all of you for coming and helping us to do that, but this is a critical point. The American people send us here to Washington to conduct critical oversight of this administration, and we need to be able to hold the administration accountable for failures here. We have had once-in-a-lifetime flooding in my home state of Michigan. I want to thank you again for being here today, but that point just needs to be reiterated. Severe weather events will not stop. Our communities have to be resilient, and we cannot wait any longer. In April of this year, Michigan was struck by extreme severe weather, causing flooding, tornadoes, and widespread damage. The National Weather Service issued a record number of flash flood warnings and flood advisories, a total of 62 of these advisories for Michigan in April alone. This extreme weather caused 7 river gauge sites to reach major flood stage, and 4 sites set new record crests. Fortunately, the state of Michigan has worked with federal partners, and the president issued a major disaster declaration. The process of rebuilding is underway, but the progress is slow. Mr. Matheson, how would the FEMA Act of 2025 mitigate the risk of future damage to Michigan's electric grid during storms like these?
It would mitigate it because it places greater emphasis on doing pre-disaster funding for mitigation to harden systems. And on the electric side, that could mean a variety of things, be it burying more lines underground, be it hardening substations to prevent damage from high wind. And so the FEMA Act creates a set-aside specifically for rural areas for the pre-hazard or pre-disaster mitigation. That would be very helpful. The second thing it does is it addresses the issue that was raised earlier about the road that gets washed out and they have to be required to rebuild it exactly the same way. Right. This legislation allows for more latitude to rebuild and not build it just the way it was, where it's in the same floodplain, move the poles a couple of hundred yards, one direction or the other, get out of the way. That creates more resilient system as well. So this legislation has a couple of components that would really position electric cooperatives to be able to withstand damage in the future.
Yeah. Thank you. Agree completely. Proud to co-sponsor it. We hope Congress gets on board with this full committee in championing it. One thing the American people might not fully realize is that when actual employees and representatives of FEMA come to hearings like this, we can engage on critical legislation. They can take it back and they can champion making sure this legislation gets back. So I need to just continue to put that in the record, how important it is not to do anything to undermine you all coming here and your great testimony. So in addition to the flooding I just mentioned, Michiganders are still dealing with unprecedented 2025 March ice storms, which impacted electric co-ops in the state, including in my district. This storm was a huge shock to Michigan, and I'm grateful that this co-op had access to public assistance funding that was available to them. Mr. Matheson, I want to come back to you again. It's my understanding that the FEMA Act would provide for loan interest accrued as a part of the ice storm. Can you touch on, again, just why that is such an important part of the FEMA reform?
Big issue. And Great Lake Energy is one of the co-ops that's affected, and so much of their system was taken down. And their loans right now are about $10 million a year in interest that they're accruing. So this just goes directly to the ratepayer. And this is a disaster where it took a while to get the disaster declaration from FEMA. I'm sure you're well aware of that. Ultimately, it did happen in terms of all the categories, but the reimbursements have not come yet, and so that interest continues to accrue. As I said earlier, sometimes FEMA has reimbursed loan interest, sometimes it hasn't. This legislation is going to make it much more straightforward where loan interest is accrued and paid for by FEMA.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate you all being here, genuinely. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Mr. Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the panel for being here today and the candor and insight that you're providing us on the committee today. And I also hail from Michigan, so appreciate the remarks that you made. I think it's important. One of the things that I felt was really critical in the reforms that we put forward last year through this committee was that fact that infrastructure can be not built to the exact same specs as it was when it was damaged, but rather be forward-looking into making better infrastructure decisions so that we're not, finding ourselves in the same position on a repetitive basis. I think anytime we're dealing with infrastructure, the cost of that is balanced between resiliency and the cost that comes with that, and those two sometimes work in opposite directions. But I think spending a little bit more money and doing things a little bit more thoughtful often results in a far better outcome overall. I had heard about places that were kind of more significantly prone to natural disasters where they had above-ground power lines, and they'd get knocked down every so many years, and then we'd come through and we'd put them back up on the poles, and then it would happen again because we couldn't get federal approval to just bury them underground. And so I think that alone is going to have a significant quality of life improvement and resiliency for the people of this country that expect that to happen. Sometimes I think about the laws of physics and the laws of nature versus the laws of man. We have jurisdiction over the laws of man here in this committee and here in this Congress. We can't change the weather, but we can, I think, make better decisions for how we confront that when it does happen and not put ourselves in a position of making things worse. I did have a few questions. Mr. Chaitovitz, did I say your name correctly? Did I pronounce it right? Close enough? All right, thank you. I'm sorry I wasn't able to be here for your opening remarks, but I know you talk about resiliency and kind of preventative nature of things being an important and critical piece of this, not directly under the jurisdiction of this committee, but certainly in front of us as members of Congress is this issue of housing affordability and the ability to get people into homes. We're short the number of homes that we need for the number of people that have demand for homes, and that's become a very critical concern for all of us. And one of the challenges with that, I think, is we talked a little bit here on this panel about the building codes and building to the next highest level of building code that evolves over time. But within that is sometimes things that are not related to resiliency. They're related to energy efficiency or other things like that. Can you speak to that trade-off a little bit? Because I think we want resilient homes that are not going to be, vulnerable to natural disaster without over-regulations and things unrelated to that resiliency that are going to drive up the cost of homes and price out ordinary Americans.
Well, thanks so much for the question. I really appreciate it. And I'll go back to how I focused on the economic growth argument for resilience. And I'll turn to, Mr. Fugate mentioned the Alabama study, and there's specific numbers that building to the fortified standard would save in claims about $105 million in that area, and then reduce the amount of deductibles that homeowners would have to pay. And so if you're building to those higher standards, you are getting the economic payback. That also is very consistent with the study that we talked about before. $1 invested in preparedness gives you $13 in reduced losses and economic savings. That doesn't mean that you're going to eliminate those losses, but for income, GDP, and jobs, that's going to mean more communities are able to respond and recover more quickly. And the same goes with homeowners. I think there's a good analogy there.
Mm-hmm. Sure, and I think that resiliency and maybe sturdiness of a home or a building, whether it's public, a public municipal building or whether it's an individual home is one aspect, certainly, but I have concerns that we're layering on additional burdensome regulations unrelated to the resiliency of a structure. Is that something that you think we can parse through and make sure that the regulations that we are asserting are ones that are actually designed to make homes more resilient but not unaffordable for people?
Well, really important point in the FEMA Act is the permitting reform measures there that will allow you to repair and recover homes more quickly. That eliminates the delays that are typically found when you're looking to rebuild a home, and that will help homeowners get back in their home more quickly.
Yeah, well, thank you. Well, I am out of time. I'll yield back, but appreciate all of your insight. Thank you.
Ms. Friedman.
Thank you to the chair and ranking member for bringing us together, and I want to thank the panel for being here to talk about how we can reform FEMA so that it can better serve our communities in the wake of natural disasters. Many of my constituents continue to feel the effects of the 2025 California wildfires. We are still seeing people struggling to rebuild. Their benefits are running out. They can't stay in their rentals any longer. It's really been very, very challenging. Mr. Fugate, in the immediate aftermath of a natural disaster, we saw that many families relied on charitable contributions from their churches, from GoFundMe pages. It was pretty common that people were asking for contributions to try to stack on top of the limited amount of money that they get from FEMA. But unfortunately, a lot of these families were surprised later to find out that FEMA deducts, in many cases, those charitable deductions from the award that they were getting for disaster recovery. In some cases, people were being deemed unable to receive any money from FEMA because they had gotten charity contributions through friends and family. This, of course, is extremely difficult for people to hear. Also, the people who contributed realized that they weren't really contributing to victims. They were basically contributing to FEMA at that point because it was taking FEMA out of their responsibility of supporting the victims. Very confusing for people as they were trying to find help. During your time as FEMA administrator, did you or your staff ever encounter a situation in which a disaster victim experienced this kind of confusion as they sought to receive FEMA relief due to them receiving charitable contributions?
Not specifically, but it happens. I think, I've been asked this question, and it really comes back to, it's in the law, non-duplication of benefits. So when you do a strict interpretation of that, it means any assistance. I think we ought to scrap it and just go, the only thing we're not duplicating is your homeowner's insurance. Because quite honestly, even if you got the full amount of FEMA, which we already heard, you rarely get there, it ain't making people whole. So I think we just get rid of the nonsense. First, you know how much it's costing DIG to go out there and find that? Somebody got $5,000, so we're going to, how much did it cost us to find the $5,000? Are you kidding me? Yep. Just make it clear. The only duplication of benefits would be homeowners insurance. I would even go so far as to look at other federal programs and go, I'd be very cautious about making those duplication of benefits. I would just make it, you got insurance, fine, let the insurance, and then we go there. That's clear. Everything else, I'm like, it's not even worth accounting for, and we're not making people whole. Why are we putting up impediments? But the strict interpretation of the law is the law.
No, I totally agree, and I did a press conference where I had victims stand next to me talking about how they didn't get FEMA money because their friends were kind enough to reach into their own pocket and contribute to them because they knew that that FEMA money was not going to make them whole. They were not going to be able to rebuild. They weren't going to replace their personal items. And so people were helping them, and instead it ended up costing them, and it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
I introduced a bipartisan bill called the Don't Penalize Victims Act, which is bipartisan because this is something that I think we all understand how insane that law is. I think it's imperative that the House pass the FEMA Act because that bill that I wrote and that I received bipartisan support for is now in this FEMA Relief Act so that we will no longer be penalizing people because their neighbors are generous, good people. We're going to allow them to still receive the limited amount of money that they receive. Another question for you. While you were FEMA administrator, states across the country experienced devastating wildfires. And I just want sort of yes or no questions because I know I only have a minute left now because we both got very passionate about the last one. Do you recall President Obama failing to submit a supplemental funding request to Congress when necessary in the wake of a natural disaster?
Nope.
Do you recall President Obama delaying or denying FEMA aid from communities in need?
Only one I really know was he denied Illinois because he was in the state legislature and he said, yeah, they met the threshold, but they got enough money. That doesn't exceed their capabilities to manage it. But in general, it was always, did it meet the threshold? Did it demonstrate it exceeded the state's capability? And we did it. We also said no a lot to a lot of Republicans and Democrats because I took those calls as well.
So in your professional opinion, is there any disaster response rationale that would justify rejecting legitimate, like you said, legitimate requests from states just because they voted for one party over another?
Unfortunately, the law gives the discretion to the president and never precluded that. Nobody ever anticipated you'd weaponize the disaster declarations. But the law says the discretion of the president. And again, Obama used it to turn down one that we had recommended because he knew personally that they didn't meet that criteria, so he said no.
Right, because it was a state that he had served in.
Yes.
As well. So I want to thank you. It's clear that President Trump has made unprecedented efforts to politicize disaster relief, and it's resulted in a delay of relief to Americans in need, not just in Los Angeles, but across this country. It's un-American. It's certainly not in the spirit of the law, and I thank you for being here today.
Mr. Taylor. Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Owens.
Yes.
You
Thank you.
slipped
Thanks,
in
Mr.
on me.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, first of all, for holding this hearing. I represent Utah's 4th District. This hearing comes at a critical time for us. Utah's having one of the worst wildfire seasons in our history. Over 400 fires, nearly 350,000 acres burned, more than the last 5 years combined. The Cottonwood fire alone burned 27,000 acres in a single day and threatened over 300 homes near Beaver. I want to thank FEMA for stepping up quickly with a fire management assistant grant to support our firefighting efforts in that area. But this experience has also shown us where the system can better work for the people closest to these disasters. Our local firefighters, county emergency managers, and who know their terrain and communities best. That's the spirit behind the FEMA Act, making sure disaster response is locally executed, state managed, and federally supported. So we get the help to the people faster and more effectively. I look forward to the hearing from our witnesses today and how to get FEMA out of its own way and get the help to the people who need it most, including the firefighters and families back in Utah. Mr. Fugate, in your experience running FEMA, how well does this current fire management assistant grant program actually work in real time during fast-moving fires like Cottonwood? And are there structural changes in the FEMA Act that would speed up this process?
Well, you know, the fire management assistant grants is at the discretion of the FEMA administrator. We delegate that to the regional administrators. That works pretty good, but it's really designed about the firefighting cost and what we would call Category B. Historically, most wildfires had heavy insurance. Most people had homeowners insurance, but that's changing. I think one of the problems we're running into at FEMA, or FEMA's running into, is when the fire management assistance grants can only address the response cost, but now we have the utility, you know, the poles got burnt down in the co-op. We have the uninsured homes. We have the costs that go beyond what we would call Category B, and that, I think, is something that's changing. We're seeing more major presidential disaster declarations for the wildfires. The whole intent of the fire management assistance grants was to eliminate that need. But I think we're seeing a changing environment where we're having more extreme fires. Insurance is now less of a tool for homeowners. Many of them now cannot afford it or cannot get it. It's being canceled. And so we're seeing the federal taxpayer having to pick that up. So I would continue to look at getting money quickly to jurisdictions to fight the fires, to support the extreme costs that exceed their annualized firefighting costs is a key tool. But I think wildfires are going to become more of a major presidential disaster declaration because of the unmet needs that FMAGs don't address.
Thank you. And the FEMA Act emphasizes local executed, state managed, and federal supported. From your experience, what does that actually look like in practice for a wildfire versus hurricane?
It's the Constitution. I never knew why it was an issue. All power is not reserved to the federal government, belong to the states and the people. Responding to disasters is the state's responsibility. It's in their Constitution. So I've never had a question that we should not be supporting them, that we're not running it. There you are. But when it comes to wildfires, many states are now struggling with, we used to have wildfire seasons. Mm-hmm. There's no wildfire season in California. It's a bad weather day we have wildfires in California. I think we're seeing, and this is one of the things that we never got to, but I think we're seeing, and people can debate climate all they want to. I'm just saying it's changed, folks, and the system we built ain't working. We're getting more frequent events that are occurring closer together without the time we had to recover from the last one. Wildfires are becoming so extreme now that the systems we've always depended upon and built are breaking. I think this is one of the things I really appreciate about the Fixing FEMA bill. We didn't talk about climate change, but we're addressing the issue that disasters are getting worse, faster, in a way that states and local governments are not able to budget or compensate for. And it's giving us more flexible tools to deal with the more extreme events.
Thank you. I need to ask the last question, Ms. Matheson. Many of the communities in my district are served by rural electric co-ops. When wildfires take out utility infrastructure, how well is FEMA currently set up to help rural co-ops rebuild quickly, and where does the process fall short?
Look, I think that anytime electric infrastructure is damaged, whether it's a wildfire or any other natural disaster, the key is to get the lights on as safely and quickly as possible. The FEMA Act is going to give greater certainty to how electric cooperatives go about doing that because the initial public assistance has to be done within 120 days. It removes that uncertainty for co-ops about having the resources to go in and make those repairs. So we fully endorse this bill because of that and other provisions that are going to make life better for electric co-ops in responding to these disasters.
Thank you so much, and I'll yield back.
Ms. Gillen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I represent New York's 4th Congressional District, which is a district on the South Shore of Long Island, where flooding continues to be a serious threat to many Long Islanders. As you mentioned, Mr. Fugate, Superstorm Sandy devastated Long Island, causing billions of dollars worth of damage. When flooding hits our major roads, it doesn't just disrupt traffic flow, it interferes with emergency response along our critical evacuation routes. As we deal with rising sea levels and stronger, more frequent storms, we must provide the coastal communities that I represent with the federal resources they need to enhance our resiliency and protect our residents and our property. That is why I was proud to secure the inclusion of my amendment in the FEMA Act of 2025 during last year's markup. My amendment would require that the FEMA administrator report to Congress on the national need for major flood resiliency investments to safeguard key travel corridors, and to issue recommendations to Congress on ways to reduce flooding and to secure our roadways. Mr. Fugate, as a former first responder and former administrator of FEMA, how important is it to the safety and well-being of Americans, particularly those in coastal communities like in my district, that the federal government invest in flood resiliency along our major travel corridors?
Well, it's like asking, should the lights be on? You got to have it. If I can't get there, I can't respond to it. Roads are critical infrastructure, just like power. But we have history here. We tried to do this in the Obama administration, just get everybody to build 2 foot above base flood elevation. That wasn't a big deal. It got reversed. It got put back in. It gets reversed. We got to quit building for the last 100 years. I mean, the American Society of Engineers has standards. It's based upon the 100 years of the past. What in God's name is the past looking like, helping us going forward if everything's a record-setting event? So we got to get past this idea that we're building it back the way it was and build it for future risk. That means we're going to have to over-design and overbuild to what the engineers say, well, that's not a requirement. The function of the road is the function of the road. Just being cheap about putting it back means we're going to be putting it back multiple times. I mean, I've actually seen people arguing over a 24-inch or a 36-inch culvert. I'm like, are you kidding me? Put in a box culvert. Go big on this. Quit doing incremental fixes, because as a federal taxpayer, I'm tired of rebuilding the same roads over and over again because we build them to the last standards, not what we need to build them to.
Thank you. As FEMA Administrator, Mr. Fugate, you also oversaw the agency's preparedness grant programs, including the Nonprofit Security Grant Program, which, as you know, provides essential funding to protect synagogues, churches, mosques, and other houses of worship across Long Island and across our country that are now facing even more heightened risks of attacks. First, I'm concerned because FEMA has still not awarded, I know we don't have anybody from FEMA here today, we have only former FEMA administrators. I'm concerned that FEMA still has not awarded fiscal year 2025 nonprofit security grants on a timely basis, leaving vulnerable communities waiting. And second, while FEMA recently announced the fiscal year 2026 process, it gave states less than 30 days to review and submit all their applications. And as a result, New York State opened its portal on July 1st and then closed it on July 10th. So it gave houses of worship just 10 days to apply over the 4th of July holiday weekend. Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record a bipartisan letter I signed urging FEMA to extend this deadline.
Without objection.
So, Mr. Fugate, do you agree that FEMA should extend the deadline for nonprofit security grant program and do everything possible to give houses of worship a fair chance to apply for this funding?
I wouldn't oppose it. As FEMA administrator, I try to make it happen, but you got to remember, we had a secretary that shut down anything over $100,000, and they got a tremendous backlog to cover, and also these grants have to be spent within the fiscal year. So in addition to telling FEMA to extend it, you also need to consider legislation to extend the funding into the next fiscal year so they don't die at the end of this calendar year.
Thank you, that's good, that's helpful. So what other steps can FEMA take to streamline the process to get these vital security dollars to communities that need them?
Getting a budget on October 1st would be helpful, because when we get a budget, when you're under a CR, we can't initiate the grants. So when you do a CR, and you do a CR, and then you do an omnibus, and now it's February, and now FEMA's got to get the grants out before the end of the fiscal year, do the budget on October 1st, it will go a lot better.
I agree, thank you.
Mr. Stauber, thank you very much. It's unfortunate but unavoidable reality that no matter where you are, a disaster will take place near your home. These disasters upend families, disrupt communities, and have lasting effects on our economy and livelihoods. Therefore, it is critical that the federal government can help prepare communities for difficult times and execute recovery efforts when the inevitable disaster strikes. While we all recognize the importance of this issue, Congress and FEMA have struggled to enact the necessary reforms to streamline and strengthen disaster response. This has rightfully frustrated Americans who have been let down by their government during some of the most trying times of their lives. In Main Street America, small businesses are the lifeblood of local economies. When a disaster damages or prohibits locally owned businesses from operating, it has widespread consequence for the entire community. While recovery efforts languish in bureaucratic purgatory, investments are squandered, jobs are lost, and people are hurt. Mr. Chaitovitz, what impact will the FEMA Act have on small businesses that are affected by disasters?
Thanks so much for the question. Interestingly enough, our foundation, together with Verizon, just issued a preliminary report on the impact on small businesses, and what they found was that 94% of small businesses think they can recover from a disaster, but only 31% have contingency plans in place. And about 20% of small businesses also only have budgeted to recover from disasters. So that's what we call the optimism gap. And I think the FEMA Act is well placed to help close that gap. And anything that we can do to reduce the burden on small businesses will be helpful. So, for instance, the universal application or the permitting reforms in the bill would be very helpful to small businesses.
Yeah, I agree. Streamlining determinations and the delivery of the assistance is critical for helping these communities when they need it the most. This bill also addresses how we prepare for these events, Mr. Chaitovitz. How do the preparedness incentives in this bill help business?
Well, we already touched on the building to increase code. So what is the next level of codes that we modernize codes that we can build to? That's one of the incentives in the bill. The one of the other incentives is to call on states to issue potential tax incentives for businesses and households to implement hardening measures. Those kinds of things will help with the sliding scale so that states can receive 85% of the cost share, and that's all helpful in creating a pre-disaster mitigation opportunity for companies in that area.
Thank you. Mr. Matheson, the rural electric cooperatives that you present provide power to my constituents. They are critical infrastructure assets to districts like mine. When disasters inevitably knock out poles and power lines, how would the FEMA Act expedite the help you need to reconnect our rural communities?
It's going to enhance what's already been a critical partnership for years between rural electric cooperatives and FEMA. It's been a great partnership, but it can work better, as I said in my opening statement. And the FEMA Act is going to create greater certainty in terms of timing of payment. It's going to create better opportunities for funding more resilient assets in the future that are more future-proof instead of just building as is. It's going to allow for a reimbursement of loan interest costs when co-ops borrow money because they're waiting for the FEMA grant money to come in. These are all good steps that are going to help electric co-ops in terms of meeting the needs of their consumers.
You know, our nation must do better to support disaster-affected communities, and this legislation delivers common-sense solutions to help FEMA work with the people. And I want to thank Chairman Graves for his hard work on this important legislation, and for all of you to be here to testify. You know, currently, northern Minnesota, there's many fires going on as we speak. The fires are moving from west to east. Our staff just got off a phone call with incident command and the sheriff and stuff. And so when it's all said and done, there may be a request. And we want our communities to get that funding immediately because that's what they need. That's how they need to get back on their feet. And it's across this whole nation. And I think that working together and as was stated earlier, a funding before October 1st is desirable, and it must happen because we're all counting on it. These disasters, we can't plan on them. Mr. Chaitovitz, one of the questions I had, when you said a tax incentive, is that a one-time?
One time for each business?
Yeah, one time, or is it annual? You know what I mean?
I think it's up to each state when they're implementing.
Okay, okay. Okay, I was just curious. Okay, thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Frost.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. The climate crisis is creating severe weather that is more frequent and more deadly across the entire country, and especially in my home state of Florida. That's why protecting my community from severe weather through preparedness, recovery, and mitigation has been a top priority since my first election. Besides the danger of the storms themselves, Floridians are becoming climate refugees thanks to the skyrocketing cost of homeowners insurance. Florida, along with Louisiana and Oklahoma, has the highest homeowners insurance premiums in the nation. Many insurance companies have left Florida, and thousands of Floridians are gambling with no insurance or left for settling for Florida's insurer of last resort, Citizens Property Insurance. Citizens nowadays is not that much better than being uninsured. It denies claims and then forces customers into an unfair arbitration process that the company almost always wins. It's something my office is currently investigating. We have to deal with this property insurance crisis as quickly as possible. Mr. Waller, insurance affordability is a housing affordability issue. How will the FEMA Act investments in FEMA's mitigation programs help lower homeowners' insurance premiums in disaster-prone states like Florida?
Thank you. I really appreciate the question. So one of the things is the money for the retrofit program. That money would go to make homes, individual homes, more resilient so they can better withstand storms. So if you do that and that house is more resilient, there's going to be less risk for that house, and then the premiums will follow. So if it's less likely to get damaged, or if the damage is going to be less severe because it's been hardened, then I think the premium will follow, and it'll drop with the risk.
Thank you. Mr. Fugate, from the perspective of a former FEMA administrator and former director of FDEM, the premier emergency preparedness in the entire country, how can Congress work with FEMA to ensure that insurance companies are paying out the full amount of insurance claims that my constituents are owed after a storm? It's one of the things I hear about the most when I go knock doors after a hurricane.
Yeah, well, it ain't going to be FEMA. It's going to be your state insurance commissioners. They regulate it, they enforce it, and they're where this goes. But I would say that one of the things about giving FEMA, because you know this, we've got people that have paid off their mortgage and are going bare because they can't afford $7,000 to $8,000 on fixed income. So when those homes get damaged, they're losing everything. We saw that in Ian. At least with this bill, we can repair their homes and get them back in it. So in absence of an insurance solution, this is addressing that gap. But I also have another idea. We have BRIC. Courts just ordered FEMA to do it again. Building resilient infrastructure in communities. Let's change it to what we really wanted to do. Building and sustaining insurable communities. We ought to be building back as a standard of what the insurance industry will insure. That would start changing this dynamic. Because if we can move things back to more risk-based and making sure that it's appropriate for the risk, the insurance is reflected of that, we get credit for the building codes, we get out of this where the taxpayer's exposure keeps growing. But we've really, if we're going to solve the insurance, I mean, insurance companies, they have investors. They only invest if they make money. Insurance companies can't make money if they don't write policies. So every time they pull out, they're writing off a market that they no longer can make a profit in. I realize profit may be something people are opposed to, but that's how the system works. We need to build homes in communities that are insurable, that people will make the investment to cover that risk, that they can get an honest return on it, which is set by your state insurance commissioner, and they pay out claims fully when those occur, which is also your state insurance commissioner. FEMA can encourage that through mitigation, encouraging not building back the way it was, to make better investments. I mean, we should be building that fire station I talked about earlier. We shouldn't be building it back to the code. We should build it back to an enhanced level that an insurance company will go, that's a good risk, we'll insure that.
Yeah. Thank you. Ms. Sheng, after a disaster, assessing or accessing federal aid to rebuild and prepare for future disasters should be as easy as possible. I've introduced the bill called the Post-Disaster Protection Act earlier this year, which is simple but extends the time local governments have to appeal a FEMA disaster relief denial from 60 to 90 days. The bill has been endorsed by multiple organizations. How would such an extension for appeals help a city, county, or state recover from the last storm and prepare for the next one?
I think given the complicated process of that, with the appeal would match the FEMA policy as well, and going from a 60 to a 90-day appeal is something that we would support.
Okay. And Mr. Fugate, last question. Again, given your time helping Floridians recover from disasters as a first responder and leader of FDEM, what challenges do individual storm victims face when they're trying to file a timely and accurate application or appeal FEMA relief funds?
This will be quick because we're out of time.
Yeah.
We have built our individual assistance program around the process, not the survivor. So you got to go figure it out. I mean, how many people here know that the IRS will give you credit and allow you to file an amended return and get money back? Many times that had insurance and didn't qualify for any FEMA programs, they could have got the IRS to give them a refund. We don't tell people that. We make them figure out FEMA instead of building a system that is built around them. We are not survivor-centric. We are process and program-centric.
Yeah, 100%, I agree. And just like a few months ago, I was knocking doors in one of the parts of my district most impacted by Ian, not super recent, people just moving back into their homes. Many of them were living in the sheds behind their home. Many of them were living in hotels or had to leave the state. And a lot of these people have paid off their mortgage. That's their house. That's all they have. Very frustrated with FEMA, but I think this bill is a good step forward. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Taylor.
Thank you, Chairman, for holding this meeting, and thank you also to our witnesses for the time and sacrifice you made to be with us today and for your expertise in this matter. We really appreciate it. I represent several counties along the Ohio River, and during heavy seasonal rains, flash floods threaten communities along the river. This is where FEMA needs to have policies and procedures in place to support communities before, during, and after natural disasters. I was proud to support the committee's work on H.R. 4669 and the common sense reforms we passed earlier this Congress to reform FEMA and serve our constituents better. I'm looking forward to moving this bill through the full House. I represent Appalachian communities across Southern Ohio that unfortunately struggle with broadband access. Without reliable internet access, many of my constituents use AM radio to get natural disaster warnings and evacuation instructions. H.R. 979, the AM Radio for Every Vehicle Act, which I'm a proud co-sponsor of, mandates the inclusion of AM radio platforms in all new passenger vehicles. Several members of the panel are in very rural area adjacent situations, so by a show of hands, who else supports having an AM radio for all new vehicles? Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Under the previous administration, we saw irrefutable evidence of what we long expected, that FEMA was staffed with and policy was driven by highly partisan individuals who openly discriminated against and endangered conservative victims of disasters. The fact of the matter is it's impossible to staff a nonpartisan agency in Washington, D.C. We have a lot of agencies in Washington, D.C. that are called nonpartisan. It would take an amazing amount of naivete to believe that we actually have them. I applaud this administration's effort to move vital agencies out of this area. FEMA's decisions and policies are literally life and death. They cannot be made by ideologues. It should be on top of the list of agencies to be moved. Not only would it solve the inherent bias issue, it could place the agency in a location where it could be more responsive to the victims of disaster. But for now, it's located here. Is any member of the panel aware of efforts currently being made to root out the bias in the agency? Does anyone agree with my proposition that the agency would be better off in another location?
I agree, and I think a basic premise of working for Republicans and Democrats was always disasters ain't about your party. It's about the communities that got hit, and as a nation, we always pull together to help communities. It don't matter what your political affiliation is. I work for Governor Jeb Bush, I work for Charlie Crist, I work for President Obama. That's the standard, and if it isn't, we need to fix it.
We talked a little bit today about making the agency more independent. Do you think a combination of making it more independent and moving it to a more centrally located, at least relative to population, area would be helpful in that regard. Anybody, Mr. Fugate has answered 99% of the questions, and I'm sorry for that, but anybody wants to weigh on that, I'm happy to hear.
Yeah, moving FEMA ain't going to change anything, and actually, you're going to want them here because you want to do the hearings. But FEMA has 10 regional offices, which are in the communities. We need to strengthen and encourage that. That's the delivery mechanism. Headquarters is policy, implementation, and rarely, which I did a lot, get directly involved in the response. That's what the regions are for. But moving FEMA, here's the reality. They work with the agencies that are here. You want them to account for stuff. They need to be near the White House as the president's principal advisor. Putting them in the middle of the country does nothing but break that. Strengthen the regions, keep FEMA here.
Okay, I might have misunderstood you. I thought earlier you said you thought it should be moved out of Washington, D.C., but you think it should be kept in Washington, D.C.
No, I never said move it out of D.C. Okay. If
Might have
people said they
misunderstood
want to move it out of Homeland Security, I wouldn't oppose that.
Okay, just independent, but still located here where 90% of people are Democrat or further left. Is that what you're saying?
Quite honestly, I never asked anybody what their party affiliation was, didn't care. And being in D.C., it really didn't make any difference. You know, the partisanization and all that stuff, 99% of the people at FEMA, they were just trying to do the mission. There's always the odd duck and the stupid people that do stupid things, and I had my share of them. But most of the people at FEMA, they're there for the mission. They're there to help. And being in D.C. or not in D.C., you know, most of the people that worked at FEMA weren't from D.C. In fact, most of our leadership came from state and local emergency management agencies. That's the team we built. So being in D.C. ain't got nothing to do with there's a lot of Democrats here. It's got to do the talent and the people you recruit and you put in the system. And if you're doing it on a partisan basis, you're going to fail the mission.
Well, you're recruiting in an area that has 90% plus Democrats, and you're trying to get a bipartisan staff. You think that's possible?
Yeah, you go recruit. You know where I got some of my best staff? Wounded warriors, because I could hire a veteran under Category A classification quicker than I could going through civil service. So if you want that, we used the tools. We went out and recruited. And I would assure you, most of the folks that ended up working at FEMA in the leadership roles and running the programs, they weren't from here.
Even the people that aren't from here end up reporting themselves to be 90% plus Democrat. I mean, whether they come from D.C. or not, we're talking about the people that are here that you have to hire from.
Well, again, that's opinions are opinions. I won't disagree, you know, and I won't, you know, say you're wrong. I'm just saying my observations were, if there was an organization that was not partisan, it was FEMA.
Glad to hear it. Thank you. Thank you again, everybody, for being here.
Mr. Carbajal.
Thank you very much. I look forward to getting some data from my colleague, Mr. Taylor, who I like very much, but a lot of opinions and not enough facts. And I sure hope I get that data that supports his sort of political bias that he's talking about, other than just a thought or thinking of it. So I look forward to getting that. Don't think I'll get it, but I look forward to getting that. Ms. Lee Sheng, I have heard from local governments on California's Central Coast that they're waiting months, in some cases years, for FEMA reimbursements needed to recover from the 2023 and 2024 storms. At the same time, Ranking Member Greg Stanton has raised concerns that FEMA personnel and resources have been diverted to support immigration enforcement activities. Are counties seeing any evidence that FEMA's disaster recovery workforce or capacity has been diminished? And if so, how has that affected the timelines of public assistance reimbursements?
Obviously, I think at the county level, we're a little bit immune of what goes on at the national level, but certainly we support FEMA's mission of helping with disasters before, during, and after disasters, and we certainly want FEMA fully staffed. Thank you. Ms. Lee Sheng, across my district spanning through California's Central Coast, local governments have identified nearly $100 million in delays for FEMA reimbursements. In Santa Barbara County alone, there are 23 projects totaling nearly $36.9 million still waiting reimbursements. Boy, that partisan Secretary Nome
had $100,000 that had to go before her. It's appalling why reimbursements haven't gone out. San Luis Obispo County reports more than $21 million tied up in large projects. In review, and Ventura County Hospital reimbursements claim that they have been waiting for years for obligations. What do delays like this mean for county budgets, infrastructure projects, and the ability to prepare for the next disaster?
Well, I think there is widespread agreement on the reimbursement process taking a long time. Certainly, I think that everybody who looks in disaster management knows that's something that can be approved upon, but certainly very, very hard on smaller counties that don't have the debt capacity, don't have the tax base to support having those funds, the immediate needs in front of them with a disaster, and having the financial resources to counter that. So this is probably one of the largest segments of this FEMA Act that NACO supports, and we want that the processing time to get reduced in the form of giving upfront spending.
Thank you. Ms. Lee Sheng, some of the counties and local governments I represent describe constantly changing documentation requirements and repeated requests for information throughout the FEMA public assistance process. Some have shared that they have had to repeatedly resubmit documentation and respond to changing guidance as different FEMA staff become involved in their projects. Is administrative burden becoming one of the biggest obstacles to disaster recovery?
I think when we looked at this, the task force, as well as our NACO members, looked at this as well. Yes, that is the common theme that we have seen. It's complicated, there are delays, it is slow, and sometimes you have to start a process over again. And so I think when we discuss it at NACO, that is the widespread belief, is that we need to streamline these processes, and it'll get the funding to the counties quicker.
Thank you. Now, if I was being political, like my previous colleague alluded to, this administration has put in tons of Republicans into public service. Is this what we get? Ms. Sheng, you don't even have to answer that. That was a rhetorical question. FEMA's public assistance program was designed to help communities recover after disasters. But again, many local governments now describe the reimbursement process as unpredictable and taking years to complete. In your view, what has changed, and how can Congress restore a more timely process?
Well, I think the FEMA Act is critical. I think, from a county perspective, we will see a disaster happen, and we will quickly try to do after-action reports and respond quickly to make it better. Certainly, when you look at a federal system with the amount of departments that are there, it's a very large system. It's very difficult to make quick movements and changes. It takes an act of Congress to do it, I'll say, and that's why we support the FEMA Act. But we just generally believe that emergency management and disasters are coming at us at a quicker pace. They're very complicated. We're having new challenges, and all we want at NACO is to have our disaster relief match the challenges that we faced, and so that we really believe this reform is necessary.
Thank you. In closing, let me just say, DOGE was supposed to make things more effective and efficient. It ended up costing us more, and it made things burdensome, chaotic, and bureaucratic. Thank you so much. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Mr. Cowley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We all know that FEMA has had a lot of problems, and the FEMA Act, which cleared this committee earlier this year, is certainly a major step in the right direction, and this is the way that legislation really should be done. It was done in a bipartisan way with a huge amount of local input to actually identify what are the problems on the ground, how can we improve disaster response in this country. And, this is of particular concern for a lot of folks in California, where we've been hit by some truly devastating wildfires. Of course, we've all seen in the aftermath of the LA fires how many homeowners have struggled to be able to rebuild and how the process has been incredibly slow there. But perhaps even more so in several communities that I represent, much smaller communities that were struck by fires that weren't necessarily on the national radar, but then they just went through terrible ordeals trying to rebuild their communities in the aftermath, people not being able to access their home, not even be able to start rebuilding on their home. Mr. Fugate, you mentioned in your testimony one of the provisions of the FEMA Act dealing with repair authority. So could you just talk a little bit more about that, how it might help homeowners in this type of circumstance who are trying to recover and rebuild?
Yeah, I mean, this is basic, Economy Act. If you're not appropriated and authorized to do something, you can't do it. Nowhere in the Stafford Act does it say FEMA can do permanent repairs. So we use shelter authority and we weasel word it and try to figure out how to do it. This would give clear authority. So instead of putting a tarp on a roof at about $7,000 to $10,000, we can actually repair the roof. Now, if the home's burnt to the slab, this is not going to help them. But if there's damages, walls that were damaged, and you need to make repairs to get the power back on, to get people back home, it makes more sense to me as a taxpayer to spend the money to do permanent work to get people back in their homes than to provide a temporary solution that ends at 18 months and they have nowhere to go.
Yeah, total common sense. For folks who have been through the trauma of losing their home, the last thing they need is to have arbitrary bureaucratic barriers that stand in the way of getting back in their home or starting to rebuild their homes. Another important thing that the FEMA Act does is really shift the paradigm towards disaster readiness and prevention. So Mr. Chaitovitz, you talk about this some in your testimony. Can you shed a little light on how the FEMA Act will make us better prepared to stop wildfires before they happen?
Well, appreciate it. So the formula-based funding where they switched BRIC from a competitive approach to formula-based will make funding more reliable to those communities and homeowners in order to receive the funding ahead of time, to prepare ahead of the disaster, to implement those measures that can help mitigate what might happen going forward. The Chamber also supports the Fix Our Forests Act, which we also is passed through the House early in 2025, and so those things together can be very helpful in moving forward with wildfire prevention.
Yeah, and I think the formulation behind the FEMA Act that several others have mentioned, locally driven, state managed, federally supported, is exactly the right formulation for all these things. And on the prevention and mitigation front, I have a couple measures that I've introduced. One we're introducing this week. The first is the Safe Homes Act, which is giving folks a tax incentive for mitigation work that they do on their own homes, strategic tree removal, upgrading materials, that sort of thing. And then the second, which we're going to introduce this week, is a bill related to biomass. And we've, as we've seen, one of the things that's made it more difficult to have effective forest management in our state is the industry has really collapsed when it comes to the timber industry. One of the potential uses of timber has proven to be economically difficult, and that is in biomass. And so when it comes to actually getting these facilities up and running, a lot of times they don't pencil out, even though it provides a good economic incentive to do tree removal that is actually good from a forest management perspective. So with that kind of externality, positive externality, we think that there is a strong case for federal incentives there beyond just the incentives you get for the production of energy, but for the construction of the facility. So this week we're going to be introducing legislation that will provide a total 30% tax credit for the cost of building a biomass facility, which is another thing that I think will move us in the right direction in terms of prevention, and we'll have a host of other benefits as well. So thank you, Mr. Chair, for convening this hearing. I hope to see the FEMA Act enacted into law this year, and I yield back.
Ms. Titus.
Thank you very much. Thank all the panelists for being here. I was the ranking member of the Emergency Management Subcommittee, so I've long been working on these issues. And one of the things that has concerned me is getting FEMA to recognize and be involved in a disaster that greatly impacts my district, and that's extreme heat. Extreme heat kills more people every year than tornadoes and hurricanes combined, and floods. Last year, there were nearly 300 heat-associated deaths in southern Nevada, and just this weekend, temperatures have already reached 111 degrees in my district. That's why, along with Mr. Stanton, I introduced the Extreme Weather and Heat Response Modernization Act. This was to bring FEMA more into the process to help them better address the issue of extreme heat and provide communities with more resources like cooling centers to address the issue and keep people safe during these times. key provisions of the bill were in the FEMA Act, which I'm very pleased passed out of this committee last year. One of them was to convene an advisory committee to study periods of disaster that are slow onset or non-contiguous, which is what extreme heat is. So I would ask you, President Lee, in your testimony, you talk about how the Jefferson Parish experienced 43 consecutive days of record-breaking heat in recent years. Now, that's a different kind of heat from in Las Vegas. That's not a dry heat like we have, but it's just as threatening. I wonder if you could talk about some of the challenges you faced at the local level responding to this kind of non-traditional natural disaster, and how having federal support would help you to mitigate the threat.
I think what you said is very key, that it's a non-traditional disaster, and certainly that has been our experience where I come from in Louisiana. In 2023, we had 43 days of record-breaking heat. That hazard, I generally like to say it hazards make babies. That hazard caused an infrastructure line to break where I had to turn off the water for 100,000 people. That hazard of drought also caused something called saltwater intrusion, which I didn't even know about at the time, which threatened the entire drinking supply in the greater New Orleans area. So again, this is the importance of the FEMA Act, is we are seeing different kinds of challenges, different kinds of hazards that we've never seen before. We had snow where I come from in Louisiana. We've never had snow before. So it's very frightening, to be frank, and we want as a country to have a disaster reform and disaster response that matches the new challenges that we face.
I appreciate that. And this is going to get worse with climate change. We're going to see more of these kind of instances, and we're going to see it in places where you haven't seen it in the past. Extreme heat doesn't get the attention that it deserves because it doesn't make for good TV. You can't see the big flood, you can't see the tornado results, and it's more prolonged. When did it start? When did it stop? Who all is impacted? Can you offer any suggestion for how FEMA might better work with local governments on this issue?
Well, I think especially in this act, what we want to see is mitigation reform, and that is something that, especially with heat, for where I come from, it's challenging to all of our infrastructure. Not only does extreme heat affect people in vulnerable communities, but it also affects soil conditions. So a lot of things are going on underground that you don't know about that are going to pop up. So I think the mitigation piece in this and moving to a project-based mitigation instead of a competitive will help on that front.
Thank you. Mr. Chaitovitz, we're talking about how heat impacts lives, but it also impacts livelihoods. Can you talk about kind of how the toll of extreme heat is on industry?
Well, thanks so much for the question, and I agree with President Lee Sheng about the kind of the multi-hazard nature of heat and its relationship to drought, and drought has direct relationship to the economy, impacting not just agriculture, but sectors across the economy, like electric cooperatives.
Also on forest fires, you're seeing more connection with the drought and the heat and the forest fires.
Sure, the issues related to wildfire that were raised earlier, the pre-disaster mitigation provisions in the bill to look ahead of the next disaster so that we can address an all hazards approach, I think is an appropriate way for FEMA to address this, and the bill is well positioned to do that.
We see a lot of spread of data centers in wide open spaces in the Southwest where heat is an issue, and how's that going to connect to water use and power use? I think it's going to be part of this discussion.
Can you repeat the question? I didn't.
Well, it wasn't really a question. It was just an observation
Okay.
about
Yes,
the
ma'am.
impact of data centers on this as well. Thank you. I yield back.
Ms. King-Hines.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for your insight and sharing your experiences so that we can all learn and hopefully be better contributors in terms of the reforms that we're discussing. I represent the Northern Mariana Islands, where we have been through more than enough named disasters that we don't measure disasters by years anymore. We measure them, we don't measure time by years, we measure them by storms. And every time we try to get back on our feet, something else knocks us down. And just to give you context, We got hit by Typhoon Soudelor in 2015, which was described as the world's strongest tropical cyclone. And then in 2018, we got hit by Super Typhoon U2, which was described as the strongest storm anywhere on Earth in 2018. And then 2020, we all got hit by the pandemic, which basically brought global tourism down to like a standstill. And because, you know, tourism is our economy, it killed that too. And then earlier this year, and by earlier, 2 months ago, we got hit by Typhoon Sinlaku, which lasted for 4 days and was described as the world's strongest storm of the year. And then just a week ago, we get hit by Super Typhoon Bobby, which was described as the world's strongest typhoon to hit, right? In just a matter of time. And so in having these conversations about reform, I do agree that everybody needs to have skin in the game. And I guess this is a question to Mr. Fugate. What happens when communities, and you know, how do we look at these policies and these reforms to consider communities who are experiencing these disasters not in a singular, not as a singular event, but are feeling this cumulative impact and no longer have skin in the game? That no longer have skin to give.
Yeah, I remember the tracks were all going to Guam, and now they shifted north. And if you went down to Guam and you looked at how it got rebuilt, fortunately it had a big military, so that supported that. It changed the construction. There were no more wooden poles. Everything was concrete. They had to harden. And I think that's where, from a federal taxpayer, the advantage is we should not be putting CM&I back the way it was. We should be building for the fact that you're going to have continual exposure to super typhoons. And a lot of construction that people would think would be appropriate don't work there. That costs more money on the front end, but it doesn't make sense to keep rebuilding every time. And as you pointed out, the frequency of the occurrence of these, it was for a long time. Guam got hit. Saipan and CM&I got outskirts. Now you're getting hit directly. Now, and this is kind of like how Southwest Florida feels, and get hit like 3 hurricanes in a row. You get to the point where we can't keep doing what we've been doing and expect it to work. I think that's where the bill gets to is we're going to have to change what we're doing. But I think more importantly, this concept of building back based upon 100 years of data and standards won't work, especially in your situation. So we have to build for future risk. We have to build as if super typhoons are not rare events. And I think that's a hard thing for people to get around because they think of these as singular events, and you know they're not. But communities get hit hard, they go, that was our disaster for 100 years, and we'll go back to the way it was. And then it happens 5 years later, and they go, I thought you said that was a 100-year event. They have no idea what that means.
It's like every other month now.
It does not make sense to do incremental improvements because it will only fail for the next one. It's like rebuilding a fire station that got hit by a Category 4 hurricane and building it to the building codes. It will fail in the next Category 4 hurricane. Why don't we build it for the function? So I think that's really, this bill gives that flexibility, but it's also going to come back to FEMA working with the governor and Congress. There are going to be some cases where the rebuilding cost will be substantially higher in the territories than it would be domestically. We had to rebuild homes in American Samoa. People had heart failure at what it cost. We also have Buy American, which also conflicts and causes problems because all the resources have to come from the mainland. But if you build it back the way it was, you'll have it destroyed again. It's as simple as that.
Thank you for that. I'm running out of time. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Garcia.
Thank you, Chairman, Ranking Member, and to all of our witnesses. Of course, let's be clear why we're here. The President is weaponizing the federal disaster aid process. Since 2025, residents of Illinois have faced severe storms and tornadoes that have damaged homes and businesses. In my district, communities like Burbank, Summit, and Chicago's southwest side endured intense thunderstorms last July. This heavy rainfall flooded roads, overwhelmed drainage systems, causing severe flooding of people's basements. Flooded basements cause mold, which creates health hazards for residents, especially children and the elderly. Families have been forced out of their homes while expensive repairs are made. Despite the extensive documented damage from the July 2025 storms, the president denied the state's major disaster request. Unfortunately, it wasn't surprising. The decision fit the larger pattern of denials of requests from Democratic governors. It is yet another example of the president's willingness to put politics over working families who are the affected ones. This hearing is also timely due to the release of a report by the Subcommittee on Energy Management detailing how FEMA staff and resources are being shifted to support ICE and CBP. Let's let that sink in. The people tasked with responding to disasters in the U.S. were diverted to provide support for executing arrests, raids, and patrols for ICE and CBP. The same ICE and CBP that killed Lorenzo Salgado Araujo in Houston, Joan Sebastian Guerrero in Maine, Silverio Villegas Gonzalez in my district in Chicagoland, Alex Preddy and Renee Gold in Minneapolis, and others over the last year and a half. The Trump administration deportation machine truly knows no bounds. This report clearly lays out how this administration has repeatedly undermined FEMA's primary mission. My questions. Mr. Fugate, thank you for being here. In your opinion, why is it important that the FEMA administrator have clear operational authority over the nation's emergency management system, free from interference from DHS?
Do you really want a committee coordinating the response? Because that's what happens when everybody has a say. Giving FEMA, the administrator, which the law says they've got, but if they're not allowed to do that, now they're having to go through all these other people who weigh in, who have their ideas of how to do it. That's the problem. You can't run disasters by committee. You need to put people in accountable positions. And remember, FEMA's not running the disaster. FEMA's running the federal response in support of the governor. And so that ability to do that job, to execute on behalf of the president where the authorities arise to meet the needs of those states, not always giving them what they want, but what the law allows, and working as much as possible to get to the margins. That's the job. And when you have to go through multiple opinions, other people weighing in, a secretary that imposes a $100,000 purchasing a limit, which in FEMA would be like a joke. I never did anything that was under $100,000, which meant now when I activate, to send the search and rescue teams to Texas for the flood, that's $1 million to crank up a team. And they got to get permission to do that. You know how much time that delays? Those are the kind of decisions we had told our staff, make them, we execute. You gave us that authority. You gave us authority to respond before a governor asked for help. But if you got to get a committee to make a decision, you're losing every advantage you gave FEMA. And if they're not executing the authority, it slows down response and it causes more problems.
Thank you, sir. And just quickly, does a reduced FEMA workforce impact the agency's ability to lead and support comprehensive emergency management system?
Well, you're not going to like this answer. The answer is yes and no. Yes, because of the complexity of how we run things. If we did the FEMA Fix FEMA Act, we can run it with a lot less people. Most of the staff are tied up in recovery. If we simplify procedures, we can do it with fewer staff. Running it as today, it takes a lot more people than you realize.
Thank you, sir. And that's why I support this bill, because emergency response and disaster relief should be nonpartisan. It shows how absurd the structure at DHS is. I'm ready to approve this bill. Thank you.
Mr. Petronas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this important meeting today. Ladies, gentlemen, thank y'all for being here, and especially your expertise and time. Mr. Fugate, thank you for your service to the state of Florida and also our nation. It's a thankless job, You take a lot of arrows in the front and in the back over your career. Hate that you come from Gainesville, but it is what it is. But really, you're admired and appreciate for your candidness today. I had the honor of being the state CFO and fire marshal in Florida for about the last 9 years, and had 9 hurricanes that we respond to, and it was interesting watching the evolution of people's confidence and ability to make decisions over time as they kind of understand what the battle rhythm of what to expect. The one thing that I've learned, and I point out to people all the time, especially when it comes to the insurance claims process, and you think about a person that lives in their home. Most people in America, if they're in the ability where they bought a home, they're living at home, they bought it. And you think about how much smaller that audience is, maybe the home they live in, they built it. Who in the hell rebuilds a home? You know, it's overwhelming. And I keep on speaking just to the point of where I'm most familiar with hurricanes and the trauma and the vulnerability and the challenges and the fussing at local government. And there's a reason why they call these events disasters. They don't move smoothly. But to Mr. Fugate's point earlier, sometimes you got to make a decision and move on because you've got to be able to start to put things back together. Your comments regarding, you know, allowing FEMA to get into the space of rebuilding, I would like you maybe to elaborate on that, because that's always been something I was excited about. You know, instead of giving somebody $37,000 or $38,000 worth of limited expense money over the period they're entitled to over 18 months, you could have given them, you know, $9,000 and they could have fixed their roof and they'd be back in their home. Where's the impasse for those type of solutions from becoming a reality? Why can't we have that on a consistent basis?
Well, Representative, and again, I thank you for your service as, you know, Insurance Commissioner, Fire Commissioner. That's not an easy job either. We used to measure recovery by how many blue roofs we had.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah.
We'd fly over and go, we got blue, we're recovering. No, you don't. You got a patch that will last 6 months and then it's gonna fail. And it's costing us through the contractors $6,000, $7,000, $10,000 to put in that tarp up there.
That's right.
Because FEMA can only do temporary sheltering. So we were sheltering in their homes. By giving them permanent authority, you can go, well, instead of putting and we may still put the patch on there to begin with, why don't we fix the roof?
Mm-hmm.
You know, even if I did a full roof replacement and brought it to code, that's $30,000 to $35,000. That's a lot cheaper than putting a travel trailer, mobile home, or paying 18 months of hotel expenses. And I get people back in their home. And you saw, as I did, if we don't get them back in their home quick enough, they're never getting back there.
That's right.
You got to get the power on, the air conditioning on, stop the water, control the mold. And if we lose that home, we just lost another workforce housing that will never get rebuilt affordable.
Well, you're exactly right. And then you got the trauma of 18 months later, well, we got to get you out of your mobile home that FEMA's provided for you, and how hard it is on that community because you're trying to stabilize it, putting a roof over somebody's head. But I've always thought that was such a brilliant idea of a better use of taxpayers' dollars and, you know, pre-event contracts for repairs. With Mr. Walker, let's talk about insurance claims a minute. So in Florida, what we did, we would set up insurance claims villages and we would bring in people. But now we played a role of dealing with insurance fraud and how predatory the environment is. I mean, I told people, I said, the public adjusters and the shady contractors, they're better pre-staged than utilities are. I mean, it is what it is. They are there waiting to pounce and get people to sign up. And some of the horrific things that I saw people go through. But, you know, the challenge that people got, it is what it is. You know what? I think everybody can find, you know, the salesman that approaches them in a vulnerable time with a gas can and a case of water pretty attractive, but sometimes an insurance adjuster, the frustration they get. And I have to explain to people, I said, it's not like you're replacing a 26 Chevrolet Tahoe that has a VIN number that thousands of them are produced and they're all cookie cutter. Every home was built at a different time, a different day, but where is our shortcomings of helping build more consumer confidence in the claims process? Is it the role of government to do it? Where can the industry step up?
So we're talking about the fraud after a storm in particular?
All the above. And ensuring the policyholder gets money in a timely manner. Because here's the deal. We all have insurance and it's embedded in our mortgage. Sometimes I don't even know that it's in there. Some people don't know that, but please elaborate.
One of the things I thought of when you were talking about the issues after a storm, I've seen more states pass laws regarding assignment of benefits. So it prohibits that exact situation where, you know, a roofer rose up on your yard and they step out and they tell you, hey, your roof is torn up, but it's okay, I can take care of you. I've got this iPad, just check a couple boxes here. You won't even have to deal with your insurance company. I'll deal with your insurance company. And, oh, do you have a deductible? No problem, I'll take care of that deductible too. That sounds great. And like most things that sound too good to be true, it is. What we often see is that shows up to the insurance company. Our first notice is when we get a bill that may be 2 or 3 times what it should have cost to repair that roof. Now it's a problem. We start to, now this is the first time we know about it, and we let our insured know. It's the first time the insured knows because they weren't aware that they gave up that claim. And it puts them in a real spot, you know, because if that issue isn't able to be resolved, and sometimes it isn't, that roofer can then put pressure on the insured by saying, or the person that had the house saying, I'm gonna put a lien on, and maybe I'll just foreclose on your house, and that way I'll get all this money. So I've seen states pass that, and the commissioner in Kentucky said, you know, I can't do a lot about storms, I can do something about fraud. And that has really helped in some of those states where they've passed that.
Mr. Figures.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you guys for all coming to what I thought was the FEMA hearing, but it appears that it's the Craig Fugate oversight hearing today. But I appreciate you being here. Certainly appreciate you guys' collective expertise. You know, FEMA plays a critical role that you guys all know in helping communities prepare and respond and recover to disasters. And as we examine opportunities to reform the agency, our goal should certainly be to ensure it can deliver assistance more efficiently, effectively, and equitably to the Americans who depend on it. This discussion is especially important for communities like those I represent in Alabama's 2nd Congressional District, which includes my hometown of Mobile, that has a very interesting FEMA history with being the location where President Bush uttered those famous words about then FEMA Administrator Mike Brown doing an excellent job in Katrina recovery. But as a Gulf state, Alabama is particularly vulnerable to tropical storms and hurricanes. Every hurricane season, our communities prepare for the possibility of those devastating winds and flooding and storm surge and prolonged power outages. In recent years, we've also seen severe weather become more frequent, more intense, and more costly. Whether it's hurricanes, tornadoes, flooding, drought, or severe storms, communities across Alabama are facing disasters with increasing regularity, as are many communities across this nation. Over the past 5 years alone, Alabama has received at least 6 major disaster declarations, and communities across the state continue to face severe weather events that strain local resources. Several of those counties are in my district. In addition to Mobile, counties like Barber County, Bullock, Butler, Clark, Conecuh, Crenshaw, Monroe, Montgomery counties, Pike counties, Russell and Washington counties. Look, as these disasters become more frequent and more costly, we examine whether the federal disaster assistance process is working as intended. I represent a district where the individual median income is about $33,000. And I know President Sheng, your communities there in Louisiana are not much different. And so when these disasters come through, you know, a lot of times what we see, I heard I was talking about tarps, Representative Petronas was talking about tarps. What we see in a lot of situations in my district is those tarps are going on houses that people don't own. They're going on rental properties, essentially. And I grew up in Mobile. There's some tarps that have been up there 20 years, 20 plus years. Can you talk to me a little bit about the challenges that you face in communities where you have this sort of income level and the challenges that are unique to those communities and how you think FEMA can better assist those people who are not necessarily homeowners?
Yes, I think one of the elements of the FEMA Act that would directly help those people is the universal disaster application. Obviously, you get relief in over, I think the number I've heard, 17 different federal agencies give disaster relief. And when you are a member of a vulnerable community, you've lost your housing, your kids are displaced, trying to reach and access those benefits are very, very, very difficult. And it ends up being the locals have to help them to the extent that we can. So the benefit, it's there, it's legally there, but how do you access it is very, very difficult. So we really promote the universal disaster application for benefits for survivors, and that is in this act.
Thank you. Mr. Fugate, what are your thoughts on the matter in terms of how FEMA can be better streamlined to provide assistance for those poorer communities?
You know, a lot of those rental properties, because we treat it like a business, and so we're not supposed to provide business assistance.
Yeah, that's my point, yeah.
A lot of those are second homes, people retired, they rent their homes out, and that's the affordable housing. I'm not talking about the investment firms that go up and buy them. I'm talking about people that don't even have the resources to make repairs. But we put a wall up saying if it's privately owned and being rented, it's not eligible. And we're losing housing stock. I don't know if that's FEMA, that's HUD, but you've seen it, the mayor's seen it. We've seen this every time. When a storm hits, a flood hits, we lose the workforce housing. And those rental properties are key, because if that people that had insurance on those rental properties, when they rebuild them, they're not renting them at what it was before. So we're getting priced out. It's a whole. I don't think the FEMA Act can address this. I don't think FEMA, the current Stafford Act, is addressing this. But I think of all the things, insurance, these are symptoms. We're losing workforce housing faster than we can build it. And I'm not talking just affordable housing. I'm talking about where firefighters live, doctors, nurses, paramedics, people running the local home improvement stores. They can't even afford to live in their communities. You've seen this in Mobile. We've actually watched the progression as people have moved inland and inland because there's nothing left in the communities used to live in that they can afford. And it's getting worse.
Well, I appreciate it, and I look forward to working with my colleagues on ways to address that. Thank you.
Dr. Babin.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And it's very sobering testimony there, Mr. Fugate. Thank you. And I want to thank the chairman and ranking member, and also thank you to all you witnesses here. As we consider reforms to FEMA, it's important that we focus not only on improving disaster response, but also on strengthening disaster preparedness before storms and other emergencies even occur. Families, businesses, and local communities in my district, in the Texas 36, Southeast Texas, very, very familiar with hurricanes, tornadoes, and a lot of floods. We know firsthand that preparing before a storm makes landfall can save lives, reduce damage, and speed recovery. I recently joined local officials at a Hurricane Preparedness Expo in Chambers County, which I represent, where we discussed the importance of helping communities prepare before disasters strike. These conversations reinforce that effective preparedness begins at the local level and depends on strong coordination among federal, state, and local partners. And I want to say how much I appreciate all of you all being here today. Mr. Fugate, I recently participated in this Preparedness Expo in Chambers County, where local officials stressed that preparation is key to saving lives. And as Congress considers reforms to FEMA, what are the most effective steps that FEMA can take to help communities better prepare before a hurricane makes landfall? And where do you believe that the biggest preparedness gaps still exist? You've got a long resume, and I appreciate your service.
It's not the FEMA Fixing Act, but this committee oversees is the Emergency Management Preparedness Grant Program. That is a 50-50 cost share program. That means state and locals put up 50%, and the federal taxpayer puts up 50%. That helps fund in many communities, especially in your district. They couldn't even have an emergency management director out of their budgets. They couldn't afford it. But when it's 50-50, they make it work. And I think that program gives us the basis of having competent emergency managers and the baseline program. Because I think that's one of the things we always forget. We can do everything for FEMA, but if the state and locals can't execute and run it, we haven't fixed it. So I think those grant programs that are pre-disaster, especially that program that is a 50-50 match, is the best investment for the federal taxpayer because it builds capabilities. It allows communities to handle the disasters that never rise to the federal level, but when the federal level is implemented, it works. The biggest gap, too many people think it won't happen to them. And then they expect somebody to come save them.
That's right.
And that's why I'm adamant. The public is part of the resource. The public is the first responder. They get there before anybody else. We got to quit treating them as victims, treat them as part of the team, and make it clear. It don't matter what government does. Government ain't going to get to you fast enough. Most of the time, you're going to be rescued by a neighbor. We ought to be building upon that.
Amen. Southeast Texas has endured devastating storms, and I remember them very vividly. Hurricanes Harvey, Laura, Beryl. Looking back on these disasters, what lessons have been learned that Congress should incorporate into FEMA reform that would improve disaster response and long-term recovery for communities that face repeated hurricanes? And other than the 50-50 cost share that you were talking about, what else can we do?
Again, I think it's working with the governors and the local communities of when does it make sense? Because what we don't want to do is, and I think this is a real problem, we got too many communities that are waiting for somebody else to come take care of them, and they want to invest their own money. That's why I like the 50-50, because that keeps everybody's got skin in the game. But how do we make sure that when we're spending federal taxpayers' money, it is buying down the federal taxpayers' exposure? That's why the sliding scale is so critical, because it recognizes states that are doing more, that have more skin in the game, that are buying down their risk, and the federal taxpayer should reward that. And for states that are failing there, they shouldn't continue paying the full price.
Amen. Thank you so very much. I appreciate all your service, Mr. Fugate, and thank you all to all you witnesses for being here as well. So I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Ms. Poe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, when FEMA was created, its purpose was simple, to centralize emergency disaster release so communities could get the help that they need and get it fast. States and cities put their lives in the hands of FEMA. Communities like mine believe FEMA will, in fact, be there for them, regardless of their political affiliation or where they live. But sadly, as it's already been spoken about earlier in this hearing, that clearly is no longer the case, and that is no longer true. And I say that because earlier we heard the statistics whereby since President Trump was sworn in, FEMA has only just approved 23% of those disaster requests from states that have Democratic governors and 2 Democratic senators. And this all while clearly blizzards, heat waves, and catastrophic rain have only increased. And I realize and know the response that was given earlier, so I'm not going to ask the question, but make no mistake, FEMA absolutely can benefit from reforms. Too often, communities are waiting for months or years to receive aid. Mr. Fugate, you were in New Jersey with President Obama after Hurricane Irene, and know the importance of communication and coordination, an area that could indeed be improved today. Yet FEMA has slashed its workforce by 6,000 workers. It has delayed or eliminated the release of vital funding and resources that state like mine depends on. Mr. Fugate, very simply, because I know our time is very short, yes or no, do mass firing and eliminating funding negatively impact FEMA's ability to effectively perform disaster response?
It's neither yes or no. The simple answer would just say yes and move on. The answer is it's very complicated. There's a tendency to think we measure response by number of bodies and seats, and that's not how it works. And how many staff we have is really about how effective the staff are in the programs. I think fixing FEMA Act addresses the complexity that requires all the staff, and it can be done with fewer staff. Remember, in the Obama administration, my staffing level at the maximum is less than the current staffing level at FEMA.
Well, you know, thank you for that, but here's what I would just say. Just last Friday, President Trump denied disaster aid to 4 states, including an $84 million request from New Jersey for February's extreme winter storms. That in itself, once again, I think it's important for us to make sure that we have the ability to provide those services, whether or not it is with the ample number of employees, as you've mentioned, or to making sure that we are not eliminating those very employees who have the wherewithal and the proper training and the ability to perform their job. So I think that's the important part, and we need not make decisions just simply on political decisions. But thank you very much for that. Again, I think FEMA has been critical in trying to prevent catastrophic harm through the agency's disasters mitigation funding. Mr. Waller, your group, the National Association of Mutual Insurance Company, has spoken in support of pre-disaster mitigation funding. These programs have been critical investments to prevent catastrophic harm. Tragically, this administration is gutting that as well. Fortunately, the federal courts have ruled that the administration illegally dismantled the BRIC and ordered its restoration. However, the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program has had no funding opportunities released for fiscal year 25 and fiscal year 26. Mr. Waller, quickly, can you list 3 ways in which pre-disaster mitigation programs help prevent costly post-disaster rebuilding?
Sure. So when in the FEMA Act, it provides for a retrofit program for our existing housing stock, which is very important. So those homes will be hardened when they get that money, so they're less likely to have damage or less likely to have severe damage. That saves money, both on the repairs and insurance is going to follow that risk. But also with the BRIC program and the money that's been invested this year, if the public infrastructure is stronger, then as you heard earlier, we're going to be able to, if the roads are dry, the pumps are working, the lights are on because the substations have been hardened, all of those things, we're going to be able to get in quicker to assess the damage as the insurance industry. And the construction workers are going to be able to follow us more quickly and get those repairs done. So I think in all those ways, it'll benefit the public.
Thank you so very much. My time has run out, so I will thank the chairman, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've been through far too many disasters in my state of California, especially in Northern California. So I'm all too familiar with FEMA, and Mr. Fugate and I have interacted on many occasions over the years. But to start off, just to speak to this politicization issue that keeps getting brought up by the other side, here's what I know in California. Billions of dollars in FEMA aid have come through. In the first Trump administration, when we had the Oroville Dam spillway disaster and there was a request for federal funding, it came through from the Trump administration. When we had the deadly Camp Fire, the deadliest fire in California history, every single federal request for aid came through. And even in the LA fires, $2.7 billion has been allocated to California for the LA fires. So to say that somehow this is being politicized is completely ridiculous. And in the case in California is Exhibit A of that. We've had many disasters, and we've asked for that aid. And I also, look, FEMA is a little bit like lawyers, right? Everybody hates them until you need them, right? And I will say there's been many occasions where FEMA has come through and been very helpful in some calamities that we've experienced in the state. Doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be reform, and appreciate the comments of former Director Fugate on that point. I think many of those things were identified. I want to move into real business here, which is, let's talk a little about wildfire, and in terms of hardening, there's been a real focus on just like full hardening of existing homes. It's, number one, that's very expensive, especially if you're talking about retroactively doing it to an older home. What about partial hardening and clustering, that helps provide community defense? Might that be actually a lower cost and maybe even more effective way of dealing with wildfire disasters? And maybe I'll go to Mr. Fugate and then Mr. Waller if you wanted to follow up on that.
A blunt answer, a partial home still is burned down. I mean, it's pretty much, everybody's complaining about the cost, but if the home has combustible material exposed to the outside and we get a fire and they start that blowing, because when you get into Paradise, what you found was it wasn't the fire, it was the embers. And once one home lit, they were all gone.
The rest of them went too.
So if you're not going to increase the space between the homes, you're not going to enforce the, no having any combustibles around there, and you're not going to use building materials that are non-combustible, I don't know if a partial works in these extreme conditions. I mean, we face the same thing in utilities when we harden. Do we go underground or we merely harden? So it's a trade-off. It's a risk decision. Do we buy down risk enough where it's a good investment, or are we just setting up the scenario where it will work some of the time, but not in the catastrophic wildfire? And again, I realize people, they make this all about affordability. I look at total cost of ownership. Will my home be there after the fire?
Yeah,
that's what I
get
want to
that.
know.
Mr. Walton, like community defense, certainly clearing around homes. We have to keep combustible materials from around homes, but clustering, is that a function that maybe helps reduce risk?
Yeah. The only thing I would say in addition is that, we start off by talking about the embers, and they can fly for miles. And so from the community perspective, yes, if we're, from a community perspective, reducing the fuel load, paying more attention to the vegetation, things like that, and making the community more hardened, then I think that's going to help overall.
And then just to follow up on that, in the wake of wildfires, especially in places like California, insurance premiums have markedly increased. How do the provisions of the FEMA Act speed up and improve mitigation funding, help make insurance more affordable, especially in a place like California where we've seen rates go up quite a bit?
Sure. Well, I think when the grant money is used for things that we know from building sciences that will better harden and protect houses from wildfire, that's going to reduce the risk, and I think insurance will follow that.
Yeah, well, that's good news. I mean, we want to do things, and that's why I think this legislation is so important. We need to bring down insurance premiums, especially in places like California. Then my last question here is hazard mitigation grant program. We've had a lot of issues with that. The lengthy environmental review in obligation. So for example, in Shasta County, FEMA received project deliverables in July of 2023, but EHP review didn't finish until May of this year, 2026. So that's just one example. These delays put critical wildfire mitigation work at risk, especially when the state match funds expire in 2028 and cannot be extended. In this committee's FEMA Act, it would address several of those structural problems we're seeing with those delays. From your experience, what are the most important structural changes FEMA could make to improve that hazard mitigation grant program?
Staying with me, I think some of the upfront funding would really help. It gets that money out quick so the work can begin quicker.
And I see my time has expired, so thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Ms. Fucci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for their testimonies and to our chair and ranking member for holding this timely briefing today. When Hurricane Helene devastated western North Carolina, lives were lost, bridges were swept away, and businesses and homes were destroyed. Both federal and state investments have proven to be critical in helping rebuild these communities. Just this weekend, FEMA announced another injection of disaster relief funding for North Carolina, totaling $48 million, while at the state level, Governor Stein signed a budget bill last week that included more than $700 million for Helene recovery. While I am immensely grateful that these hard-hit communities continue to receive much-needed federal and state relief, there is still a great deal of work left to be done. I think there is bipartisan consensus that FEMA needs to work more efficiently to coordinate disaster relief and recovery efforts, and that's a large part of why we're here today and why the FEMA Act is so vital. But it also has escaped me that despite this consensus, this administration has been making it objectively harder for FEMA to do its job, redirecting over $500 million from FEMA to build migrant detention centers, reassigning FEMA caseworkers to process deportations instead, and making drastic funding cuts and staffing reductions. Administrator Fugate, can you speak to the ways in which these actions from the administration may be compounding FEMA's struggles to quickly
and efficiently provide much-needed disaster relief to affected communities across the country?
You know, I don't even think it's the money or the staffing. I think it's the morale. People at FEMA were so scared in the first part of the administration with the way the secretary operated that it was paralysis. They couldn't make decisions. They couldn't authorize anything over $100,000. Of all the damage that occurred in that first part, I'd say it was the morale and fear of FEMA, just people doing their jobs. It has more impact than people realize. It isn't the money. The Stafford Act didn't run out of money. There was money there. They transferred it, but it didn't run out. They moved staff around. The issue was, I think, morale. I think that's changed. You have the acting administrator, Bob Fenton, who is a seasoned pro, probably one of the most experienced emergency managers in the country. He's been given full authority to run that. You now have a nominee going through a confirmation process. You have a secretary that's letting FEMA do its job. Money is starting to move. There are still issues there. But I would say it was the morale. Yeah, if you're going to cut staff, you can cut staff, not the way they did it. I would say more about how FEMA employees were treated, the disrespect, the threats, the fear has had more impact on FEMA being able to do its job. That was a specific person and an advisor that produced that environment.
It's good to hear those changes. Following up on that, during his time in office, the president has also significantly cut funding for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. In what ways might this hamper or harm the work of FEMA in regards to national disaster preparedness?
FEMA depends upon our partners at National Weather Service for forecasts to determine where and how we prepare. We don't wait till the disaster happens. So on weather events, whether it's a forecasted extreme flood event or hurricane, those forecasts are critical because we're going to spend tens of millions of your taxpayers' dollars to go get equipment and personnel in place. The better the forecasts are, the more likely they have the stuff where they need it, when they need it. If the forecasts are not as accurate, that's going to be a problem. The one thing I would say, we've not seen dramatically a change there. And we also saw that after all the cuts, the National Weather Service has gone back to hiring people. But I am still concerned there are certain areas where, yeah, we're only doing radiosondes once a day. The models are still working. But I know that during hurricanes and tornadoes and other severe weather threats, they're doing it, used to do it 2 to 3 to 4 times a day. It made the models more accurate. So we don't have a definitive case where I can say that's where it failed. We're on the edge.
Thank you for that, and I yield back.
Mr. Weed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Over the past year, Wisconsin, my home state, has experienced 2 separate severe weather events which resulted in widespread damage to private and public property and subsequently met the requirements for major disaster declarations. I'm thankful that the requests for individual assistance in most of the jurisdictions requesting public assistance were recently approved by the Trump administration. However, the process gave me an up-close look at the many challenges that the counties face when disasters strike. Ms. Sheng, in your testimony, you cited a concerning statistic that 20% of your members that with open public assistance claims process for like up to 4 to 6 years, and it was 28% at processing times exceeding 6 years. Under the current reimbursement model, delays like this present a significant threat to areas which are forced to bear the upfront costs for repairs during that time frame and lack the financial means, obviously, to do so. I'm glad that the FEMA Act would transition the public assistance program to a grant-based model. And I was hoping you could speak a little bit on that as to how that would help prevent future backlogs and what else Congress should consider in the coming years to help with that.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the most important aspects of this legislation is currently transitioning to a grants-based model rather than a reimbursement model. So when you have a reimbursement model, the locale and the county is forced to use their own funding or take on debt to handle the recovery. and it takes years that we've shown, a very, very long time to put that money back, which could be used for other needs. And so if we can go to a formula-based model, and really across the board, when you speak to counties, they just need the resources in a shorter period of time, more upfront. And I think if that part of this act gets passed, we would really move forward in disaster assistance in this country.
So obviously, there's some that are still waiting, have been waiting for 4, 5, 6 years.
Yes.
What can be done for those jurisdictions?
Well, I think the frustration is every project's different. I mean, Mr. Fugate knows that. I think if the rules change in the mid-cycle, that will delay a project. I think if a change of personnel, not only on the federal side, but on our side too, we lose staff as well. And then, you know, if you get an experienced person who was with you during that hurricane and then they leave and a new person comes in, it really sets you back. So I think an overall simplification of the whole system, making the rules simpler, making counties understand what the rules are at the get-go, would really move us forward a lot in terms of that and reduce the processing times.
You had also mentioned there's a lot of bureaucratic red tape
Yes.
throughout this process.
Yes.
And I've heard from constituents across our district too. It's obviously a very a difficult thing to navigate disaster recovery. Specifically, smaller counties, they often lack grant writers or technical staff to navigate the red tape in the first place. So something that the Universal Disaster Assistance application in the FEMA Act obviously is meant to address. In your opinion, what else can we do here in Congress to navigate or to make navigating federal disaster easier?
Well, I think, as you mentioned, the universal disaster application would absolutely help survivors. We have challenges to put back a water system, a sewer system, to bring our own public networks back up to place, but we're also in charge of helping vulnerable people who are outside of their homes, people who need assistance, drawing down the benefits from the federal government. So that would certainly be help. And then the mitigation piece. I think I come from the greater New Orleans area, and we can speak about mitigation. Katrina happened to us in 2005, probably changed emergency management as we are in a country. We went back, the federal government went back and built a hurricane reduction system. It was an investment that was made, and we saw with Hurricane Ida in 2021, it worked. It worked. We did not see the flooding that we saw in Katrina. We did not see people on roofs of their home hoping that helicopters would rescue them. The mitigation works, and I think the counties being able to mitigate their risks. We know what our risks are in our community, and having that mitigation dollars and changing that formula would be crucial to changing the outlook of our country.
All right, thanks. Mr. Matheson, you cited an example of a co-op in Arizona that saw its entire system destroyed by a windstorm, yet due to the remote nature of the territory, it didn't meet the threshold for disaster declaration. This is the exact fear that I hear from my constituents. Of course, we're in a very rural area. That small localized disasters will leave their areas in a state of disrepair and unable to access the federal aid. So if you could just explain a little bit about FEMA Act's approach to lower disaster thresholds and how that would fix that gap.
Well, clearly, this is an issue where these more sparsely populated areas, where the infrastructure still costs the same to replace, we have fewer people who can shoulder the burden. The FEMA Act creates a much better set of criteria for allowing those locations to be qualifying for FEMA aid. It's one of the reasons we're such strong supporters of this legislation.
All right, thank you. I yield back.
Ms. Hoyle, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First of all, I want to thank the panelists for being here. This is critically important, and Republicans and Democrats have long recognized that FEMA is too slow, too bureaucratic, and often fails to help communities rebuild stronger. In an effort to prevent fraud, there are administrative rules that are incredibly burdensome for victims of natural disasters who have lost all ability to provide documentation, who have lost their homes. I know for us in the 2020 fires, we had a lot of our manufactured home parks where our farm workers and low-income seniors lived that were just destroyed, and they had no ability to have, to build back. We are still in Oregon waiting on $371,000 from a 2017 2016 disaster and millions of dollars from our 2020 fires, where we lost over 1.2 million acres. In 2024, we had 1.9 million acres burned and roughly a $350 million in response cost. And we expect that this year we'll have a really bad fire season as well. So, you know, before 9/11, FEMA was an independent agency. And that allowed FEMA to focus on disaster response as a cabinet level agency. We now have between 30 and 40% of FEMA employees that are temporary employees, because previously you'd have a natural disaster and maybe 4, 5, 6 months later you'd have another one, so you know you didn't want to have people there permanently. We now have year-round disasters. There's hurricanes, there's floods, there's tornadoes, there's fires, there's ice storms, and I think that under DHS, and Mr. Fugate, you pointed out how when Director Noem was heading up DHS, it had a terrible effect on the morale of employees who, again, couldn't do their job and were concerned about the politicization of FEMA. Disaster response should be nonpartisan, and that's absolutely critical. So Mr. Etzel and I introduced the Power Act in response, you know, for myself to the 2024 ice storms, after hearing firsthand from utilities and my 5 rural electric co-ops that FEMA would pay to rebuild infrastructure as it was, as opposed to how it needed to be. So this is why I am supporting this bill. Mr. Matheson, I would like you to talk about specifically, because I represent so many rural communities where our rural electric co-ops are critical in preventing wildfire and also in the response. What would you like to see from FEMA and for us to do in a bipartisan way to make things easier to prevent and then respond to disasters?
Well, first of all, for FEMA, this legislation we're talking about, the Fix FEMA Act, addresses many of these concerns, including what you just mentioned, which is there are opportunities when we can build something back in a better way and not just replace as is. And we've got lots of examples, and we've heard some in this hearing, where because it's restricted, you got to build it exactly as it was. That doesn't make sense going forward in terms of the future risks we have. Outside of this bill that we're talking about for this hearing, the Fix Our Forest Act would be very helpful. It's passed the House. We'd love to see it move through the Senate. But again, for wildfire mitigation, from an electric utility standpoint, the Fix Our Forest Act is a critical opportunity. It passed the House overwhelmingly. We'd love to see that signed into law.
Well, we don't deal with that on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, but fundamentally, I know that every agency and every office, mine included, is only as strong as the staff that are in that agency. And if we're kneecapping people's ability to actually do their job by putting them out to do immigration enforcement when we actually need them responding to disasters, I think that that is a poor use of our resources. And I will once again say, I will work with anyone, Democrat or Republican, to work to make FEMA an independent cabinet-level agency. Again, Mr. Fugate, I know you don't like quick yes or no questions. Do you think that's a good idea?
It's better than what we got.
Amen to that, sir. And with that, I yield.
Mr. Hurd.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fugate, if Congress passes this bill, the FEMA Act of 2025, what objective measures should we expect to see improve in the next 5 years?
FEMA gets the money out faster with greater accountability with less overhead and cost.
And how will that be measured?
You measure it and you get Congressional Budget Office has to score this. Is go, how much does it cost to get $1 of assistance out? How much does it take us $1 to get here to the mayor? You know, in some of the smaller disasters,
Okay, so what should it be? Like how much?
You're probably spending a couple bucks to get $1 out the door.
Okay.
So I would go, what is it now? What does it go to? I would look at the timelines of FEMA resolving this, getting the money out the door, and can they do it with fewer staff? This is really, I think, where the savings in this bill is reducing the number of staff and the time it takes to get the money in the hands of the local jurisdictions so they can start building, and that will save money.
How long would it take for, what should the timeframe for measuring this be? Should it be 1 year after enactment, 2 years, 3 years? How long do you think it would take for this to trickle down?
I wouldn't give them a week. They already have this authority. They can do this. They just refuse to, both at the local, state, and federal level. You're just making it mandatory. So they already have the mechanisms. We've already done this. This should not take a year to implement. This can be implemented, I think, within weeks. Because once the bill passes, they're giving a time to phase it in. But the idea of doing quick grants based upon estimates was already given to FEMA in the Sandy Recovery Improvement Act. It was optional.
Yeah.
And people, both on the federal side and state and locals, thought they were going to lose out and didn't use it. Okay. This makes it, this is the way we're going to do it. So the fact that they can already do it and the fact I've already done it means it's implementable today. It will not take, and do not give them 3 years. That just ensures they'll wait you out until somebody else changes their mind.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Very, very helpful. Mr. Waller, disaster preparedness isn't just a public safety issue, it's an affordability issue. Everyone wants to lower insurance premiums, but insurers ultimately price risk. In your experience, what's the single most effective action a community can take to become more insurable? Is there something that actually moves the needle from the underwriting perspective?
You know, I think the FEMA Act really helps with that, with the mitigation on two fronts. One, through the BRIC program, making public infrastructure harder so it's going to survive storms. That's going to help. So after there's a disaster, we're going to be able to get in more quickly because the roads are going to be dry, the power is going to be on, things like that, and you can get people behind us to do the work. And then I think just communities being harder. You know, they're going to cost less money to insure because there's going to be less damage. So when you're able to, you know, control risk like that, that's going to help with insurance.
Thank you. Mr. Matheson, having represented rural electric co-ops before going to Congress, I can appreciate the important mission that electric co-ops have after a disaster, get power back on quickly and safely. From your perspective, what's the biggest obstacle that FEMA creates or could remove to speed up restoration, power restoration after a wildfire or disaster?
I think the obstacles are addressed in this legislation, but in no particular order. I think the 120-day limit for the initial funding, that would be very helpful for co-ops. I think the ability to pay for loan interest if there's a long time before FEMA provides funding for permanent work, that's helpful to co-ops. And finally, the pre-disaster mitigation funding component of this bill is really a step forward in terms of allowing electric cooperatives to get in front of this issue to some degree. That's what we've been talking about for a lot of different sectors, but for us, that would be very helpful.
Talk to me a little bit about that mitigation. So if we spend billions of dollars responding to disasters, if Congress shifts more money to hardening the electric grid beforehand, where would rural electric cooperatives invest the most? What makes the most sense to put those dollars to right away?
In the co-op world, everyone says we're unique, so it's tough to give you an answer about their all.
If you've seen one co-op, you've seen one co-op,
exactly.
right?
You know the phrase. That being said, I think each co-op would make what's in the best interest for their community. We heard just from the representative from Oregon about wildfire mitigation is a big hardening component in that area. Other areas it may be for flooding. So different locations are going to dictate where co-ops would invest those funds.
Okay. I think the last thing I'll say is I think Congressman Collins said his district in Georgia had more electric co-ops than Colorado's third. I'm not sure I have to dispute that with Congressman Collins. We have quite a few great electric cooperatives in western and southern Colorado. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Van Drew.
Thank the chairman. And I want to thank the chairman. He's delayed his own testimony so that everybody else would have a chance here to go first, and he's a gentleman. I want to thank the witnesses. This is the part of the hearing where you all are tired. Seriously, it's been going on for hours, and the questions do become a little bit repetitive. But we're members of Congress, so you know we're not going to let the opportunity go anyhow. We're still going to talk, including me. And I guess I would say, you know, it's sort of indicative, FEMA, where we are with America a little bit. We can do better. America is innovative, it's smart, it's hardworking, it's faster, it's stronger. And it's sort of this whole FEMA problem, I think to some degree indicates how we need to do better. And by the way, let me say this. it's something we can fix. You know, healthcare is a huge issue in our country as well. It's really complicated. I'm a dentist. I've been involved in some of those conversations and issues. This is something we can fix, and we can fix relatively rapidly. And that's why we want to keep speaking about it over and over again, because it's been awful. And it isn't. And by the way, Mr. Fugate, I want to thank you all for being here. You all are great, because I did watch, even when I wasn't here, I'm jockeying 2 committees today. Your testimony is candid, honest, and sincere, all of you. But I just want to point you out. It was not political. It was focused. And thank you for your testimony. But to all of you, it's not about the amount of money. Really, I've seen sometimes where we throw money. I've been involved in politics a lot of years. It's not about the number of people that are working. Don't get me wrong. Staff and money is important, but in itself is not the answer, and God help us sometimes makes it worse, and we can do so much better. I'm at the Jersey Shore. I'm in South Jersey, for those of you who are familiar with it. We get whipped pretty good. You think of Florida, and we've got some communities that are on the top 10 of most vulnerable communities in the United States of America, places like Cape May. And I remember, I've been there. I've been a county commissioner. I was a state assemblyman, a state senator, all before Congress. Man, on the ground when people were going through this stuff, and they hired a bunch of people. Tons of people came in. And sometimes you were getting 2 and 3 different answers. You shouldn't need a PhD in government bureaucracy if you're just a victim of these storms. We've got to make it simple and easy and fast and effective. And I think we can do it. We know that the delayed recoveries are nearly as damaging as the storms are themselves. We know that there's more than 1,000 disaster emergency and fire management declarations that still remain open. Some remain open, some are dating back decades. The current system stretches across more, and I'm looking to make sure I'm right, and I am, 30 federal entities in total. It's too much. It doesn't work. It's bureaucratic paralysis. So let me ask some questions. Former administrator, I'm going to give you a little break because everybody's been asking you a lot, and I think your answers were good. President Sheng, local governments are usually the first to respond, and they're the last to finish rebuilding because they only have so many resources. Which federal, if you can, which federal requirements create the greatest delays? Where were the greatest inefficiencies? And where can we shift things closer to the local level while making sure that there's no corruption and there's still integrity?
What was largely discussed is the public assistance program. I mean, that's what we're familiar with, that funds the local assets that we own, and that's what we're largely talking about in terms of the reimbursement for counties. And so, again, the smaller communities are absolutely overwhelmed by the disaster itself. And then, as I mentioned, there's a financial disaster behind the scenes that they have to cough up a lot of expenses across the community. They might have limited borrowing capacity to do that. And so the upfront money that we could get from FEMA would be just critical. And we're talking about the cost, but we need to look at the cost of how long it takes for a community to get back on its feet. The longer it takes and the slower the recovery that we get back, that the longer a business takes to open, we lose our revenue. That is our source. That is our fuel for local government. We lose revenue, our sales tax base.
I can just interject there. You're so right. I mean, I remember Superstorm Sandy and other storms. Jersey Shore has gotten hit a lot. Businesses just never came back, some of them. They got killed.
Yes.
And we could have done better. So I thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for your answer. I know it. Real quickly, Mr., I don't want to say your name right, Chaitovitz. Did pretty good? Okay. Besides the incredible reforms that are in this bill, and damn it, we should do this thing if we really want to make a difference. We don't talk about it enough almost in America. We get so tied up in the political stuff. But anyhow, anything else besides what's in the bill do you think could really be helpful?
Well, we've talked a lot about the incentives and the sliding scale and how that's going to help states. There's been mention by Mr. Kelly of a bill to provide tax incentives from the federal level for households and businesses to help harden, and I think that's one thing that certainly the chamber has been supporting.
It's a good idea. Thank you all. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Bresnahan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for persevering to this hour in the day. But this subject's quite important to me. Northeastern Pennsylvania is certainly no stranger to natural disasters, especially from flooding. From last year's flash floods in Honesdale to Hurricane Agnes in 1972 and Tropical Storm Lee in 2011, these storms devastated our entire region. In the Wyoming Valley especially, the question isn't when the next flood, if the next flood comes, it's most certainly when is the next flood going to hit. And once you smell flood mud, it's a sensation that you will never forget. So that's why it is so important that the committee passed the FEMA Act, which includes my bipartisan bill, the SMART Act, which directs FEMA to figure out whether its mitigation dollars are actually working. Vital programs like the BRIC program need to be focused on actual mitigation so communities in northeastern Pennsylvania can get to work rebuilding and reinforcing their levees. I don't remember 1972 Hurricane Agnes, but I certainly remember the photographs of the devastation. And in 2011, we saw something similar, and it was truly devastating, where entire communities' property tax bases were completely eroded. And I've heard from several communities that we have put in the timeline to work to meet every federal standard, and they still get stuck behind an outdated flood map that doesn't reflect any of it. So my first question, Mr. Waller, does completed mitigation work undertaken by communities, does that traditionally translate into lower NFIP premiums for homeowners in that area? And if so, how long does that process normally take to see the actual rebates or the savings?
I don't know the actual time that there usually is between seeing the mitigation and the change in premiums. But I can tell you that the market is healthy and it's competitive, and when you have a healthy competitive market, you're going to see, as soon as someone sees the experience and they show that in their rates, then I think there's pressure on the industry to follow suit.
I think it's after those investments are made, we need to make sure that those investments are actually paying off and generating an ROI, because it's certainly leading our communities and political subdivisions and creating apprehension, because they obviously want to do right by their constituents and their friends and their neighbors, but ultimately they want to actually see that ROI and having those premium dollars reduced. Something that we also have seen, because of the geographic location, some of the property owners are grandfathered in from escalation of those premiums, but if they were to ever transition that property to a family member or sell it, the next buyer certainly isn't given that same stature of increased protection. So we've seen property values of $300,000 homes now, because they're inside of a flood map that's already been rectified or it's been corrected. It doesn't flood there anymore. The proper mechanisms have been deployed, but they're still inside of that zone, and those families are having a hard time selling that property because of the proposed increase. So I'm going to ask Administrator Fugate, if we want FEMA to be more proactive than reactive, would treating flood map reassessments with the same urgency incentivize communities to make these investments in the first place? And I think all of these questions tie together, because we want to get to the root cause of allowing the communities to make the necessary investments. But how do we incentivize these communities to be proactive instead of reactive?
Just fixing the flood zones isn't the answer. And here's a problem. Just because I'm not in a zone A where I have to do mandatory purchase, it doesn't mean I won't flood. And too often the people drop flood insurance and become an uninsured loss. Flooding is growing faster than any other hazard, including wildfires. It's more costly than any other hazard, including wildfires. And it's occurring in areas that are not in the high hazard risk area. Those maps are insurance maps. They're not flood prediction maps. But I do agree that if a community can go in there and do the mitigation and move that out of a flood zone, it isn't an indication they don't need to buy flood insurance, but it does reduce the cost. And that should happen relatively quick. However, remember, Flood maps have to be processed, passed, and adopted by ordinance by that jurisdiction. And there's often disagreements on how much should come in or come out, and I've been on the other end of that. But yes, if we are able to do mitigation, we can take people out of the high-risk area, not negate they need flood insurance, but lower that cost and reflect that in the maps, which are adopted by ordinance and then are enforced by ordinance. Yes, we should be able to move that faster.
I appreciate that. And in closing, I just want to recognize our National Line Worker Appreciation Day. And as a former electrical contractor myself, I've seen their work up close, the hours, the conditions, the risk it takes to get power back on so families and businesses can start to recover. Sometimes they don't get the credit they deserve, and nearly not as often as I would like to see. So I want to say thank you, and with that, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. I want to thank each of our panelists for being here today. Pretty much all of my questions have already been asked and answered from all kinds of various perspectives throughout the course of the hearing here, so no more questions from me. But I do want to thank you. This has been, I think, a really great and exhaustive hearing with a lot of really good information shared, and so greatly appreciate that. The committee now stands adjourned.